Good morning, Excellencies, dear guests from abroad and Bangladesh, and dear friends from the media. Let me, on behalf of the organizers, the Center for Policy Dialogue, the Southern Voice on Post-MDGs, and the UN Millennium Campaign, extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this expert group meeting on Asian Partnership in Financing the SDGs. Dear guests, as you know, the third Finance for Development conference will be taking place in Addis Ababa on 13th to 16th of July 2015. And this conference is very important in terms of identifying the various modalities of financing development in the context of the current challenges that we are facing. Particularly, this upcoming conference is also very important because of its because it's taking place before the September meeting of the UN, where the Sustainable Development Goals will be discussed and finalized. Keeping this in view, all over the world, a process has been initiated to identify various modalities and means to help implement the SDGs. And in that context, the three organizers, co-organizers of this expert group meeting, we have convened this expert group of the Asian countries in order to discuss how to contribute to the Addis Ababa process. So the objective of this expert group meeting in the Asian context is to discuss how we can identify the particular challenges that Asia is facing, how we can find the means of implementation of the SDGs in the Asian context, and then prepare a report which will be integrated with the report of the African countries, which is also, there was an expert group meeting also in Africa, and then contribute to the Addis Ababa process. There will be side events in Addis Ababa, and on behalf of our partners, there will be presentation in Addis Ababa based on the outcomes of this expert group meeting. So I think that this is very important that this is taking place in Bangladesh, a country where we do take pride from the achievements that we have made in the context of the MDGs, and also there is a process in Asia and in Bangladesh in terms of identifying the various means of implementation of the SDGs, and we would like to contribute to that process. So keeping that in view, we are very grateful that you have assembled here, and we are very happy to have our Honorable Minister for Finance and Minister for Planning, Mr. H.M. Mustafa Kamal, Member of Parliament, who will be the chief guest at our meeting. We're also very happy that we have with us Mr. Robert Watkins as our special guest. He's the UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in Bangladesh. And we hope that we'll be joined by His Excellency Mr. Lee Wan-yang, the Ambassador of Korea. The three organizers, as I said, we are three co-organizers, and we are very happy that the Southern Voice on Post-MDGs, steered by Dr. Devapriya Bhattacharya, has been doing a lot of work in terms of advancing the cause of the southern countries. The Southern Voice is a network of 49 leading think tanks in South, which is contributing to the process of Sustainable Development Goals and taking an active interest in terms of contributing to the various processes which has been initiated in this context. We are also very happy that we have with us the UN Millennium Campaign, which is a major player in terms of bringing the voice of the citizens in the context of the SDGs. It was initiated by the then Secretary General of UN, Mr. Kofi Annan, and UN campaign has been doing a lot of good work as regards taking the process of MDGs forward, and also in the context of the current discourse on the SDGs, and we are very happy that Mr. Sering Falunier, who is with us here, who is representing the UN Millennium Campaign as the Deputy Director Policy. Dear guests, we are very happy that our participants have come from various countries in Asia, who will be contributing over the next 3 sessions in taking our discourse forward, which will be, those sessions will be followed by the framework presentation, which will be given at this inaugural session, and it will be presented by Dr. Devapriya Bhattacharya. We have a very distinguished set of participants over here, and I'm very happy to recognize also the presence of Mr. M. Saiduzzaman, our CPD Board of Trustee member, and of course he was the former Finance Minister of Bangladesh. We are extremely grateful to all our foreign guests who have come from many countries to contribute to our discussion in the framework session that we will be having in this inaugural event, and also to be followed by the 3 dedicated sessions on public-private partnership, remittances, and the role of remittances in poverty alleviation, and also a very important emerging issue, which is the data, in the context of data revolution that has been talked about, the financing of the data revolution. So these 3 dedicated sessions will be followed by this inaugural session, and we are also expecting the Honorable Finance Secretary and the Foreign Secretary in those sessions. I would like to once again really express on behalf of our 3 co-organizers our sincere appreciation of the support that has been extended by our foreign participants, and I would like to just introduce our friends who have come from abroad, and of course we have also other guests, and we also have our Excellency Mr. Johan Friesel, the Ambassador of Sweden, also with us, and also many other dignitaries from Bangladesh, but I would, for the brevity of time, I would just introduce our foreign guests. We have with us Ms. Koliafaran Jasmine Jharupand, who is the Planning and Coordinator Lead of the UN Millennium Campaign, our partner. Thank you, Jasmine. Dr. Simrit Kaur. Yes, Simrit is Professor of Public Policy, Faculty of Management Studies, University of Delhi. Dr. Alvin P. Ang, Professor, Department of Economics. Yes, Manager, Development Finance Program, IBON International, Quezon City, Philippines. We have Mr. Heng Pikede, Founder, Enrich Institute. Thank you. Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Dr. Dushni Urakon, a very good friend of ours and partner of ours in research endeavors. She is Deputy Director and Head of Macroeconomic Policy Research in the leading think tank in Sri Lanka, Institute of Policy Studies, IPS. Dr. Dedi Budiman Hakim, yes, Chairman, Department of Economics, Bogor Agricultural University, Bogor, Indonesia. We have Mr. H.K. Young, Senior Fellow, yes, thank you. Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS, Malaysia. We have Mr. Abhishek Kumar. Abhishek, yes, Abhishek. Associate Director, CARTS International, one of the leading think tanks in India. Dr. Milindo Chakraborty, yes, Visiting Fellow at another of the leading think tanks in India, RIS, Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries. And we have Ms. Nanli Collins, yes, Collins, from South-South and Triangular Cooperation, UNDP Regional Bureau for Asia and Pacific, Bangkok, Thailand. So, as I said, and we have been joined by a very distinguished set of guests from Bangladesh as well, who will be contributing to our discussion. And in the before I bring Mr. Sering Falunier, our co-organizer, I also would like to also introduce our 3 very distinguished discussants who will be sharing their comments on the presentation which will be made by Dr. Devopriya. We have Dr. Sultan Hafiz Rahman with us. Thank you, Hafiz Bhai. He is Executive Director, BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, BIGD, and he is former DG of South Asia Department, ADB. We have Dr. Salman Zaidi, Poverty Global Practice Manager, the World Bank Bangladesh, and of course we have our secretary with us, Mr. Arastu Khan, member, Physical Infrastructure Division, Planning Commission, Government of Bangladesh, and we look forward to hearing their comments on the framework presentation which Dr. Devopriya will be presenting. With those few words, and once again extending a very warm welcome on behalf of all the three co-organizers, I would now like to invite Mr. Sering Falunier, Deputy Director Policy, UN Millennium Campaign, our co-organizer, as I said, has been very active all over the world in discussing the various issues related to SDGs and bringing the voice of the citizens to this discourse. It is very important that the citizens have a strong voice when we are discussing these important goals for the next 15 years. So over to you, Mr. Falun.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me say a very big thank you to CPD, Southern Voices, as well as the government of Bangladesh for this very, very impressive and important event that we're about to begin today. To start with, let me just give a brief introduction to what our organization is, what we do, and why we got engaged in this. As the chair had said, the UN Millennium Campaign was created by the then Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2002 with the primary purpose of ensuring that there is citizen engagement in the implementation of the MDGs, in particular ensuring that governments live up to their commitments. Well, this we have done particularly in the South, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, working mainly with civil society and other non-state actors to ensure that this happens. So once discussion on the post-2015 agenda commenced, we were identified as one of the UN entities that leads outreach and ensure that what happened in the MDGs, where it took between 3 and 5 years for other stakeholders to embrace the agenda, would not happen in the in the formulation of the post-2015 agenda. Therefore, the principle, as most of us from the UN know, was that ensuring that the process of formulation of the post-2015 agenda was transparent, inclusive, and participatory. With this in mind, therefore, we went out to look at how best do we ensure that citizens all over the world, in the remotest parts of the world, do have their say in the formulation of this new global development agenda. And of course, as we know, the formulation of the agenda includes a number of things. The SDGs go far beyond the Millennium Development Goals. And then, of course, we're not just talking about the issues, but also those things that relate to enhancing or ensuring that implementation is it's properly done. Therefore, of course, amongst the very, very important issues related to the formulation of the post-2015 agenda is the issue of financing. And therefore, we're here today to look at, from our own perspectives, how we can contribute to this important debate which has been going on for a number of years. Again, stepping back a little bit, how did we get engaged into this? It all started with one of the consultations organized by the UN system on governance in South Africa, where we got a group of stakeholders together, mainly civil society and think tanks, to discuss and talk about the issue of governance in Africa. And in particular, how to ensure that the vast natural resources in Africa are made use of and properly invested in development. Now, this led us to several tracks, one of which was developing what we call an African mining vision to ensure that there is proper economic and financial governance of the natural resources. Then, of course, there was contribution to the work of, some of you may know what is called the Mbeki panel, which was on initial illicit capital flight, as well as the very famous Africa Inequality Movement, where we initiated a number of studies on this. But then what we took forward was the financing. And here, particularly as it relates to Africa, is given the way things have gone with the MDGs, where a lot of successes or failures were based on the availability of financing, particularly on the availability of ODAs, where governments actually had depended quite a lot on receiving financing from outside to fund development. And with this not being what was expected, therefore a lot of failures were realized. So from the African perspective is looking at, for the next development agenda, how do we ensure that we maximize benefits from the vast natural resources? How do we ensure that these are adequately invested in the areas that would benefit humanity? And thirdly, how do we ensure that there is proper monitoring and accountability of the use of these finances? Then now we said, well, what we needed to do really was to see how we get best a Southern voice. A Southern voice of not the normal usual suspects, but then Southern voices of non-stakeholders that would contribute to this debate. Then we talked to the government of the Republic of Korea. I hope the ambassador would be here at a later stage, and who then expressed interest in this and were willing to finance a similar study in Asia. And then, of course, talking to Professor Debab, we were able to put together this study that we are about to review today. First, looking at what are those key issues that are relevant to Asia, and therefore the reason why we suggested these three topics. But then also looking at the end of the day, how do we put together what we have from Africa, what we have from Asia, and hopefully something from Latin America, into a Southern voices as inputs into the financing discussion. So at the end of the day, there are three things that we are looking at as co-organizers of this, as inputs into the financing discussion. First is a very strong voice, but a very credible voice that outlines our perceptions, our perspectives, and how we see the role of financing the new development agenda. And of course, as we would see, the array of professionals we have in this room, I think at the end of the day, what we will come up with would be quite credible in terms of inputting into the discussion. And within the UN system, we've already talked to our colleagues in DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and they are very keen to receive the outcome of whatever we come up with here as input into the discussion, and hopefully before the middle of June, working with CPD, we will be able to come up with an outcome that can input into this process. However, our job doesn't stop there. It is one thing inputting into the process. We know in Addis there would be this conference, and at the end of the day there will be an outcome document, and there will also be commitments on financing. So the other part of this job we are looking at is how do we ensure that there is life after Addis? Meaning, how do we ensure that from Addis there is adequate follow-up, there is adequate monitoring, there is adequate reporting, and there is adequate engagement with all stakeholders to ensure that the commitments are adhered to. And this is the second part of this job that we will be doing here. So in addition to just coming up and saying these are the issues, we want as a stakeholder group to look at how do we move forward after Addis and ensure that whatever is agreed upon, whatever comes out of Addis is adequately implemented. So it is my hope, Chair, that at the end of the day, these are, well, one would be a concrete output, another one would be some sort of recommendations as to how we move forward with that. To end, let me say a very big thank you to Prof for making this happen. Of course, it was quite a difficult task for us to be able to get this moving, given the fact that there has been quite a lot of, personal changes within the UN. So therefore, the discussion started with him last year. There was some delay, but ultimately now we're seeing this to fruition. And most important of all, a very big thank you to the government of the Republic of Korea for providing the financing for this and enabling us to be able to do this. So once again, a very, very big thank you, particularly to the international participants, the authors of the papers, and all of you present here today. And I look forward to a very fruitful discussion in the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sering Falunier, for those comments and for sharing with us the context in which this particular Asian EGM is taking place, and also for sharing with us the excellent work that you have been doing in the context of Africa. You have said that we have to be engaged with life after Addis, and it is very important that we not only come up with our recommendations in the context of the Addis conference, but also to be engaged in the discussions which will be followed, so that we can relate the outcomes of the Addis with the means of implementation for the SDGs. So this is a very critical moment, and thank you for highlighting the importance of this particular meeting in that context. As I said, the Southern Voice is the co-organizer, and in fact the driver in the context of this particular meeting, which it is co-organizing with UN Millennium Campaign and CPD, and Dr. Deopriyo has been stewarding this process since 2012, when the Southern Voice was set up, and it is very, I think, in the fitness of things that Dr. Deopriyo will kick off the discussion today on the framework issues for Asian partnership in financing the SDGs. And as we have also heard from Mr. Sering Falunier, that this particular event that we are organizing here is very important in terms of setting the framework issues and also the particular 3 themes that we will be hearing and discussing. So to kick off the discussion, I would like to request Dr. Deopriyo to come up with his presentation, and we can take it from there.
Thank you, Chair, my Executive Director, Honorable Minister, Excellencies, distinguished guests and participants, a very good morning to you all. I think the 2 introductory statements has given us the perfect background against which I would like to present the framework paper. Before I do that, let me just say that what we want to do in this session is to get some broad overview of things and try to find the basic strengths and weaknesses of the financial flows and trade landscape in Asia. But at the same time, we would like to afterwards go in depth into 3 specific issues. As has been mentioned, it will be on public-private partnership, one on remittances, another on investment in data. You may notice that these are not necessarily the most usual topics which we all discuss, but we, through a lot of discussions and given the structure and the time limitations, we decided to concentrate on these 3 issues. As you have heard that in case of Africa, they concentrated more on the mining issue and transparency and many others. So that's how it is. Let me just once again recapitulate that the financing issue had been one of the major concerns in the post-2015 agenda discussions. And one of the distinguishing feature of this time vis-a-vis MDGs is that we are discussing the means of implementation upfront before the agenda is approved, and that is a very important thing. And as you know, the draft SDGs also include under all the 16 core goals, the means of implementation, and goal number 17 exclusively is devoted to the means of implementation. Now, in this context, the third FFD conference, which is, as you know, is the successor of the Monterrey and as well as Accra and Busan, and some would also add Mexico processes on FFD, will take place in July 2015. As a part of the preparation for this conference, the draft outcome document has been published. First, it was in January. It was called the Elements paper. Then the zero draft, so-called zero draft, came out in March, and now we have the revised draft, which came out in May. So anybody who is following this discussion will see how the various versions of this document is undergoing changes, which is a reflection which is essentially a reflection of the balance of political and negotiating skills happening in New York with inputs from all over. This is a picture which will tell us how the preparatory process is going about. You will see that it started quite some time now, before 2013 in some ways, if not 14. And then there was this whole, may I have the laser pointer, please? So you will see on the left side that the substantive informal discussion started, which went on in discussing the global context, how the mobilization of resources and effective use will take place, and then the enabling environment. So that was if you can see it, this is one of the substantive informal sessions which went on. And then there was this informal interactive hearings with the civil society, which took place in April. And then the drafting session starts. So informal session, interactive sessions, and now the drafting has started. As I mentioned, the first drafting session took place in January, and which resulted into the Elements paper, then the zero draft with all other inputs. And the second drafting session recently took place in April. And now we are approaching the third drafting session, and in between a revised draft has come in. So whatever we discuss today and tomorrow will be essentially structured, and we will try to channel them for the third drafting session in June. So that is the structure of the process, so we know that on that. So as I said, the objective of the paper is to essentially do an overview of the changing financial landscape in Asia. And as you can imagine, Asia is not an easy continent to deal with, given all the different types of countries which are here, starting from the OECD members, Japan, Korea, South Korea, and coming to the emerging economies of various nature in Southeast Asia. And also you have all the least developed countries and other low-income countries over here. We have here small islands, developing states. We have here landlocked countries. We have climate-affected countries. We do have fragile state. I don't use the word failed state. So we have the fragile state. We have here conflict-ridden countries and also post-conflict countries. So it's a very heterogeneous set of countries in a microcosm of the global community in some ways. So what we have done for this paper is that, since the challenge of financing is more in the low-income countries and the developing countries in general, so we have concentrated on the two sets of countries over here, one in South Asia, one set, and the other is Southeast Asia. So that is the two sets of countries we're going to look into. We'll first look into what are the trends, both in the financial and in the trade. As you know, trade is the important part of the FFD discussion, although some would contest that whether it is very in the narrow sense of the term trade or not. As you know, there are also a lot of debate going around on the mandate of the FFD, whether we go to other means of implementation like trade, technology transfer, other capacity building issues, etc., etc., and of course systemic issues. Systemic issues are there in the document. And then after doing this scrutiny of the trends in South Asia and Southeast Asia, we will do a comparison between South and Southeast Asia. What are the different types of financial support they would be needing? And then what we do towards then, we try to compare it with Africa and see how does Asia really differs from Africa in terms of their financial needs. And finally, we will try to take a look at the Busan document and also the current draft, and how does our findings fit in over there. What I have done is that you have the summary, executive summary with you, which is an extract from a larger paper. What we have done from the, since you have the executive summary, what we are not going to do is to use the figures over here. It is rather we will stick to the trends and see what is happening. Please note that when we talk about this South Asia, we are taking all 8 countries in account. But please do remember, Afghanistan in a large way really influences the trend and the outcome given its current specific state of affairs. The figures we are having is 2000 to 2013, and essentially it is what was the figures in 2000 and what are the figures in 2013 is going to in many ways tell us about the trends, how it is going about. So let me take you around in a very general way so that to highlight some of the points. If you see on the tax revenue issues, because domestic finance is the #1 item in now in the discussion, as you know, in the sequence of things, and you will see that in all countries it has been increasing. Other than Sri Lanka, I think Dushni will be able to tell us what happened in 2013, why the tax GDP ratio on that particular year it was low on 2013. But and Pakistan it has remained changed. So even if you take Sri Lanka along with it, you will see that in general the tax revenue situation has been looking up in South Asia. And if you see we take the structure of the tax revenue ratio in that sense, and you will see the taxes on income, profits and capital, the direct taxes, it had been increasing. So this is also a very positive trend in terms of the structural changes within the composition, moving away from the indirect taxes to direct taxes. And if you look at the tax on international trade, in all these countries, the dependence on customs revenues and other things have been also decreasing. So my first point on this is that we do have a very positive picture on domestic public finance in South Asia with not only tax revenue increasing but with a sense of a structural change within the composition. On the domestic and private investment, this is more dicey over here. As you can see, it decreases, increases in various cases and depending upon situation. And the gross private investment as a percent of the GDP is still a bit of a difficult territory, and possibly that's what you'd like to take on board. And that is no wonder we wanted to expedite the processes with introduction of the PPP to break through on the investment front. FDI is relatively positive, although the trend is not so high in that sense, not so discernible, but it is still high. And remittances, as you can see, other than Maldives, everywhere it is increasing. So remittance is emerging as one of the major sources of financing for South Asia, and no wonder we have put them as one of our discussion theme tomorrow. So that is there. Most interesting is that international private investment, international public finance, that is ODA, the whole region is coming out of aid dependence. That it is a decrease on the ODA GDP ratio, as you can see. So quite a number of positive signals. Tax GDP ratio is improving, aid dependence is decreasing. Within the taxes, there is structural change, and FDI is also marginally increasing. What is the major disturbing feature of this is that we do not have a steady trend in the private investment to go up in the coming days. So that is, let me come to that on the Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia's picture is much more complex. It's much more complex, and please do remember, between the period 2000-2013, we did get the global financial and economic crisis, which hit the Southeast Asia much more than in South Asia for various reasons. We are aware of those, although could have been much worse because Southeast Asia did take number of measures from the earlier Asian crisis, which have helped to overcome or mitigate some of the challenges. But let's see what is happening here. The tax revenue, but at the same time we will also have to note the Southeast Asia average income level and many other indicators are much more higher than South Asia. So one may argue after looking at the trends that the space for growth is much more in case of South Asia than on the Southeast Asia under the circumstances. So if you see the tax GDP ratio, that it is increasing Cambodia, lower income country. It is increasing in Laos, it's another lower income country. Malaysia up to a point, but here Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, they are showing, at least on 2013, they were lower than in what was in 2000. And if you see, but the good part of it, that the taxes on profits and incomes are increasing, other than in case of Singapore, that we know the post-crisis circumstances were quite acute. Tax on international trade also, in terms of the changes, were there. So we see the same structural change, but not necessarily the levels in as it goes. Private investment is much better situation in these countries than in South Asia. And FDI inflow is also quite okay, other than certain Philippines and Indonesia over here. And remittance is also increasing in all of the countries, and ODA is decreasing. So if you see the difference between South and Southeast Asia, I think the major difference will show up in case of private investment to be stronger in Southeast Asia than in South Asia, the private investment growth. And on the other hand, the public investment growth is, public revenue growth is possibly a bit weaker than the others. But in both the South and Southeast Asia, you will see the declining dependence on ODA. So that is which will give us an obvious conclusion that the future, the post-Addis circumstances, financing scenario in South and Southeast Asia, ODA may not play a big role as in comparison to private investment and FDI over there. Now let me come to the issues, the trade landscape. Again, if you look at the trade landscape, in all these countries, again, some of the results are biased by the observation of 2013 and also because of the global financial crisis. But Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives increasing, and here we find the export GDP ratio in some cases, in many cases, decreasing. But what is more interesting in this case is that the intra-regional export situation is quite good. Even look at the case of Sri Lanka, although the export as a percentage may have shown decrease vis-a-vis 2013, but obviously after the India-Sri Lanka free trade area, Sri Lanka is showing a higher growth in case of intra-regional trade. What is more interesting is that whilst most of the participant countries are increasing their intra-regional trade in South Asia, but India itself is decreasing, which is essentially means India is trading more outside the region than within the region as it goes in that way. Look at the issue of Southeast Asia. And you will see that in most cases, as I said, again, it is affected by the crisis. But Cambodia, one of the major, textile exporters now from the LDCs, is doing good. Laos is the same, another LDC doing good. And you will see here Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, and again is doing good in export. But what is striking is that intra-regional trade is increasing in all these countries, other than possibly in Vietnam. Vietnam possibly trading more with outside the region, but in all these cases. So what is the conclusion from here? In general, the export is growing, although there may be erratic trends here and there because of the crisis, other shocks, and commodity prices issues over here. But both the region, both the sub-region, South and Southeast Asia, are trading more amongst themselves than before. So it is increasing in many ways. So that is one of the future direction, that how does one support the trade within the region, which is no less important, if not more important, than trading with the rest of the world. So this is another major conclusion which will be coming out from this discussion. Let me compare now the South and Southeast Asia a bit. As you will see that in case of, and we try to do it without India, and obviously if you bring in China over here, all these things will go topsy-turvy. Obviously China itself will influence the whole scenario in many ways. If you ask me that the major shortcoming of the paper, being an author myself, that we couldn't really bring in or integrate the China factor, because the moment we bring in the China factor, it will have a totally different types of dynamics in altogether. Please allow me to write another paper on that separately. So Tax as we see, the private investment in many cases as a percentage of GDP will be contradicting over there, but this is an average which is coming out, and FDI is increasing in that way. Remittance is there in many ways. The comparison I have mentioned earlier. International public finance, I have said, and as I mentioned that the intra-regional export issue is going to get much more prominence as we move. Now, we want to do a bit of an the comparison with Asia and others. This is the whole Asia and the whole Africa, sub-Saharan Africa we are talking about. Don't get confused by the decreasing over here, because the set of countries are different from the set of countries on South and Southeast Asia. Tax revenue, in fact, will be increasing in many ways. Tax on income, as we mentioned, is still very strong. Private investment as a whole, because it comes in China and others, that's why it shows increasing. FDI flow, Africa is doing better than others, and remittance inflow is also in cases of them. The striking feature between the striking difference which we see is more on international finance, but in both cases, exports, these figures are will be a bit contradictory with the earlier ones, and intra-regional trade is also increasing in Africa. The major conclusion when we compare with Africa and Asia, it comes out in case of obviously in case of tax revenue. Africa still has a large portion of it on various kinds of export duties, export taxes on mining and minerals and others. So it was there, so it was more affected by the crisis in that way. But what is important that the private investment has increased in both set of countries, but FDI has increased much more stronger in Africa than in Asia. But obviously you know that investment had been more in the mining sector, in the extractive industry, not necessarily always in the manufacturing. And what is the second one is that the distinguishing feature is that Asia is less dependent on ODA in comparison to Africa. Obviously that is one distinction which will obviously formulate the African or inform the African position vis-a-vis the Asian position as we go. So, but in both cases, as we see, the intra-regional trade is increasing. Sub-Saharan Africa, along with South Africa, is doing, and there is a number of free trade agreement, customs unions, and connectivity projects, and etc., which are there. You are all aware of those issues. Also in East Africa as it goes. So let me come to the systemic issues. Systemic issues is quite critical for the Asian region. In fact, I was thinking, if you say in case of Africa and in case of Asia, where the systemic issues are more important in that sense. The conclusion is that in both countries, in both set of continents, the systemic issues are important, but in a different way. For example, in case of Africa, within the systemic issues, stabilization of commodity prices will be a very critical factor. But because they export primary products and minerals and extractive output. So obviously commodity price stabilization is very critical for Africa in many ways. Transparency in the mining sector had been a very critical issue for Africa. Illicit financial flow possibly is equally important for both Africa and Asia. But for Asian countries, I think the trade-related systemic issues is showing up to be very, very critical. And particularly given that other free trade agreement or sub-regional trading agreements are coming, how do they really link into as a stepping stone to the multilateral trading system? That is a major issue which will come around in that way. Given the growing importance of remittances, the rights of the migrant workers will in case of the Asian countries, particularly the manpower exporting countries or person power exporting countries, will be much more important in these cases. In case of taxes, I think in both continents and in Asia in particular, the capacities, support for capacity building, for mobilization of more revenues is critical, and equally critical is plugging the evasions and the leakages. One number we go on, although there is no dependable number, and one of the issues in the FFD document you will see is for the IMF, World Bank and others to work out what is the proper definition of illicit financial flows and how to measure them in many cases. So that is one issue which will be very critical. In case of Bangladesh, the figure which goes around from the Financial Integrity Report, the last number we go on quoting 2012, that Bangladesh received $1.2 billion of foreign aid, and the outflow was measured at $1.8 billion. And obviously 80% of them was through trade invoicing, misinvoicing and misdeclarations and other things. So that is one. The other, and the last but not the least, is the issue of coherence. The coherence issue between the investment policies, the trade policies, and development cooperation policies, and environment policy, which will be getting its more importance, and also the social clauses, the social policies, including rights of the children, the women, the migrant workers, all these issues. The coherence issue will figure more prominently in case of South and Southeast Asia as we mature more in the post-2015 area. So the point I'm making here is that we may see the trends, but these trends are not an outcome only of domestic efforts, but it is also largely affected by the systemic concerns. And as these countries are getting more and more open and more integrated into the global economy, the issue of external shocks and the effect will become more and more critical. One of the issues which is neither systemic nor domestic is the issue of the data. The data issue has captured the imagination of the global development community during the last couple of years. We have all become data revolutionary. In the childhood days, we wanted to be social revolutionaries. Now we are all data revolutionaries. What a way to put it. Now, the data issue is very critical. We are not getting enough data. We have done studies. Southern Voice has just finished 7 country studies across the world. And since this is an universal agenda, we did studies also in Canada, in the emerging economy in Turkey, and Bangladesh included. And we see, even in, if you put them, that the average globally is 50%, that data availability of the SDG 169 indicators, targets. And when the indicators come, we will know much better that, and indicators are floating around, as you know, UN Stat Commission has put it on the table. So it will, how it is going to, the issue of data will be very, very significant, and investment for getting the data right will be a major issue in the coming days. And since our planning minister is here, he is in charge of producing the national data system, in charge of that, the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics. I think he can make a bigger claim on the budget which is coming in order to invest in generating more data in the coming years. Let me see on the Busan outcome document. Most of the issues which I have mentioned fits in very well with the Busan document, because Busan talked about domestic resource mobilization. It talked about a sound regulatory environment, which we talked about. South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation. I have just shown you how the intra-regional trade is increasing, which is an expression of South-South cooperation, and we can also find examples of triangular cooperation, how the North-South-South can generate some kind of a dynamics over here, and particularly with Japan, Korea and others, Singapore. And then the Aid for Trade. Aid for Trade, engine for sustainable development, the Busan talked about, possibly is still relevant for Asia, as not as much as possibly in Africa. But anyway, we have other concerns about the Aid for Trade as it approaches another global review next month in Geneva at the WTO. So on the domestic, as you know, the Addis Accord draft, which starts with the domestic public finance, there had been debate whether it is the right way to start, but we all agreed that this is the right way to start. What is really being debated at this moment is that apart from the technical assistance and the mobilization and everything, and we have shown in our other work that the overwhelming part of the SDGs were financed not by the ODA but by domestic resources. So it is important. What is now being debated is that do we take on a target for domestic resource mobilization in the coming, for the next 15 years? Some people talk about 18% of the 18% tax GDP ratio, and all next 5 years, or having the difference between the two. That kind of a targeting issue is there. Whether that is an appropriate thing to take or not, I don't know. Yesterday I received another call from another network of civil society to do everything to stop that. because you cannot by doing, there is a logic on that. That's so this is one issue. I will leave it to that. Should we take on a target for tax GDP ratio? On international finance, FDI is an issue. We have seen, interestingly, studies have shown, and our own studies, that countries at the same level of economic development may have different levels of FDI coming in, which can be because of the resource endowment, but also largely because of the policy environment and institutional development as well. So that is one area which will be coming in. Cost of reduction of remittances transfer is another issue which goes around, although some people contest that in case of Bangladesh you can hardly squeeze the transaction cost any further, but there are other issues on the remittances, including the rights of the migrant workers and etc. International public finance, the global commitment of 0.7% of the GNI and 0.15 to 0.2 for the LDCs is yet to be met. We have now a dozen or so countries at this moment. But the issue, major issue which is being debated is that what is the value addition in Addis vis-a-vis Monterey and others? Because if you reiterate this one, then it will be in whether we are using the time right or not. There are a number of issues which are embedded in this discussion. One is about the concessionality issue, that grant, that there are low, how do you really convert with a discounting factor the loans and grants in, the loans and concessional loans into grants, and see how concessional finance is being made available. There is also the issue of total overall support. Just OECD has introduced a new concept, TOSSD, which is total overall support for sustainable development. This is a complicated one, in not going very far. But the most important issue which is being debated at this moment, which is in the draft, is that should we give a timeline to the OECD countries to fulfill their commitment? The timeline which is being suggested is 2020. That is in the draft. There have been attempts to take that away at this moment. So that is another issue we may like to see, although ODA is not so important over there for Asian countries as it turns out to be. International trade, Bali package implementation, duty-free, quota-free for LDCs, South-South trade, regional integration, and aid for trade. That is there. Let me conclude first by thanking you for all the attention you have given me in listening to me, but more importantly to say that without an institutional or a political commitment to the outcome of Addis, this best of the draftings of this outcome document will not yield any results. So it is the first, how do you really assess the political commitment to this particular issue? We, in various places, when I go around the world, we go on debating that what would you consider the success indicator of the Addis Ababa outcome. There are many suggestions in terms of outcome. Some would say on ODA, some would say on trade. But my thing is that if you get at least half a dozen head of governments from the OECD countries, I will consider that to be a success, because how the OECD countries really represents themselves at what level. For example, still the discussion is going on who is going to represent United States of America over there. We understand President Obama may not come. Will Vice President Biden come? So that, or it is at the end of the day Treasury Secretary or something else. So that will show the level of outcome. Encouraging part of it is that OECD country, the European OECD countries, European Union in particular, is showing quite a lot of interest in over there. And given that it is happening in Africa, there will be obviously a good solidarity of the African head of states coming over there. My last point is that even if there is a political commitment, if there is no accountability framework, it will be very difficult to do that. That brings us to Mr. Falu's point, the life after Addis, that how the accountability and monitoring framework will operate, that will be a major challenge. The accountability and monitoring frameworks is critically linked to the issue of what type of political architecture will be there in New York for monitoring the whole SDG process, because Asian things cannot be disjunct from what is going to happen. As you know, it is still in an area of flux. I must tell you that the word monitoring and accountability, particularly accountability is a dirty word now in New York. So the word monitoring and accountability has been replaced in the document by review and follow-ups. that will tell you the political signal which is coming. Nobody now, in the official document, it will be not monitoring and accountability, it will be review and follow-ups. So the issue of mutual accountability is very critically and hotly debated, and obviously, as you can understand, which are the countries we want a much more toned down accountability framework in this particular case. I would rest my case over here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Devapriya, for setting the discourse that we will be having over the next 2 days in such an excellent manner. After hearing your presentation, in fact, yes,
I would also like to introduce my co-author, my junior colleague Afsar. Afsar had been writing the paper with me on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations, then, Dr. Devapriya, to you and your co-author, our research colleague Afsar. I think that we have now got an excellent overview of the background and also the discourse that is now going on, and now supported and strengthened by the evidence that is coming from Asia. What has transpired from Dr. Devapriya's presentation is that the story is very diverse and heterogeneous, and although we have seen the presentation from the perspective of South Asia and Southeast Asia, within the South Asia and Southeast Asia also the stories are quite different. And if we take the dynamics also changes quite significantly over time. But what has transpired is also that as a means of implementation, the discourse that we are now having is important, because we know that the MDG 8, which talked about global partnership, has come under so much criticism, but that was one indicator which didn't have one goal which didn't have the indicators. There were a lot of weaknesses, and now the initiatives that we are now taking is a smart initiative in the sense that we are discussing these issues upfront. And from that perspective, the presentation that Dr. Devapriya has given is very important, that what are the means of implementation that we can deploy, how important are the domestic resource mobilization that we are talking about. Is it a ploy to take the responsibility off from the developed countries and put the onus on the developing countries? What is happening to the ODA? Dr. Devapriya mentioned that where is the 0.7% of the GNI commitment? So all these issues are also important, and as he has mentioned, that some of the elements which could be potentially good means of implementation in our countries, like the trade flows, the FDI, there have been some improvements, but on the other hand, obviously, we will need also ODA in order to strengthen those elements as well, our capacity to export more, our capacity to earn more through remittances, our capacity to attract the FDI. So I think that whilst we talk about South-South cooperation and North-South triangulation, I think that the need for more active engagement of the developed countries will be very important. As Dr. Devapriya has mentioned at the end, that one of the indicators will be how many heads of governments will be going to Addis Ababa, and what will be the follow-up actions after that. So that is very important. But it is good that we are having this discussion before the SDGs are finalized. So this is the one smart move, and thank you, Devapriya, for the contribution that you have made. We have three very distinguished discussants. We will bring them first, and then we will have an open discussion before I bring in the special guest and our chief guest. So I would like to request Mr. Arastu Khan, Member Physical Infrastructure Division of the Planning Commission, Government of Bangladesh, to kick off the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for
before this, he was in the finance ministry, so he knows both the ins and outs of the implementation challenges.
Not as much, actually. But thank you very much for inviting, and Dr. Devapriya, you have presented an excellent discourse, and I think that is an eye-opener. Jeffrey Sachs said on a write-up that he has done on sustainable, on financing the sustainable development. He says that financing is the glue that holds the agenda together, and which is why financing sustainable development is central to the success of SDGs. So, and in the last 15 years, we have not done badly. If you see if you compare last 15 years and the last 50 years, let's say from 1950 to 2000, and if we see that we have done in the 15 years better, because we have been, because that was a period when the whole aid architecture was plagued by the specter of a what is called bipolar world that was been haunting the world, and that has stopped with the demise of the Soviet Union. And we saw that there was an emergence of a third group called the what is called non-aligned movement. So actually, everybody was most of the countries were moved to different camps, and the use of the resources that was not predominantly important, but was important is to bring in as many number of people within the camps, the American camp and the Soviet Union camp, and there was a third camp that was also effectively to bargain and get more out of them. That's the idea. But what has happened with the end of the Soviet Union in the mid-90s, we saw that both the development partners and the governments became more, they thought that it's a good idea that we should put our heads together and do something for them. That is where we start to get to see the MDGs coming up, and where we have seen that there is some element of measurability. The measurability is something that is, I mean, when you can measure, you can manage. That is how I am saying that in the last 15 years we have done pretty well, and the advantage of this this time, because we have the Monterrey consensus and also the Doha and other in Mexico, we have those financing meetings are in the hindsight. We can effectively take advantage of those period of those interactions, and possibly we can benefit out of it. So this is an advantage we are here, and I think it's a good idea because we have two frameworks, the Monterrey framework and Doha framework in place. I think it's a good idea that we can start with, on this framework, we can start from the unmet targets that we have done, like domestic resource mobilization. Many of the developing countries have not been able to achieve that. This is one. Recommit, make the OECD countries recommit to their 0.7% GNI to ODA. That could be a starting point. We can also update the framework by reflecting on the today's changed world, which is the role of business, the rise of middle-income countries. China is now sitting on huge amount of money. They should come out of age. They should come off age, and I think that China should come in a greater way in supporting these efforts. They are doing. China continues to its aid policy and his what is called concessional loan is still being administered through the Ministry of Commerce. That should be avoided. I think they should have a separate agency of their own, like DFID, like USAID, because China is no more small, it's a very big power now. So these things has to be looked into. Engaging the private sector, which is the outcome of Busan, and then South-South cooperation, which is also, so these are the things, I think these are my opening remarks about thing. And very recently there has been a high-level meeting, Asia-Pacific high-level consultation for financing for development took place in Jakarta. And the numbers that have come, I don't understand how these are very huge, big numbers. Whenever numbers of climate change and SDGs come, or MDGs, they're huge numbers which I cannot comprehend. Like they said that at least Asia-Pacific area would require $1 trillion a year. I don't see that money. I'm in finance. I have been looking into climate change. I have seen only JEF fund, it's about $8 to $10 billion. I have seen CIF fund, $7, $8 billion. That's it. I don't see where is these billions coming. Green Climate Fund, it's a fund that has been formed, and we hope to see something. So what are the other sources, what are the other financing flows that is coming to Asia, like ODA? ODA is, for the region is $25 billion, which is compare it with the remittance, $205 billion annually. FDI, $568. These are the numbers which you can compare and get some idea about it. The Asia region's wealthiest people own about $20 trillion. Philanthropy that could be an important way by which we can source our financing. Tax revenue in Asia Pacific region average is 17.8% to a worldwide average of 28.5%. So there is a scope here. So now this is all about Asia Pacific, not only South Asia and Southeast Asia. Then the Asian Pacific Sustainable Development Goal achievement requires combined efforts between the public and the private sector. This is very important, which was not emphasized as much in the early turn of the century, but now, particularly in Busan, and also emphasis was given domestic mobilization of resources, very important. As you have pointed out very rightly, it's not the ODA that is matter, it's more domestic resource, and which is where we should be looking forward. And on the number, on the 20% or 18% and to 21%, there's an issue that looks to be looked upon. So these are the broad numbers, and on the paper itself, Dr. Deopriyo has put an excellent discourse on the matter, and I think the comparison he has made of South and Southeast Asia makes the situation gives a lots of clarity on the entire topic. ODA dependence is going down, truly, because when we were in the early years of our independence, it was about 7-8% of GDP was our ODA. Now it is reduced to like 1.5%. Although I think Professor Deopriyo would say even smaller, but it's about 1.5%. So it's going down. Private sector investment is going down in South Asia, while in Southeast Asia it's going up. And this is something private sector investment must go up. And one of the major bottleneck in Bangladesh is that private sector investment, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, haven't done well. So we are saying we are doing 29%, but government is trying to push a lot of money, but actually it's the private sector investment that makes the difference. So that's a good observation. International trade of ASEAN countries, if you say it's about 30-35% is intra-regional trade in ASEAN, whereas intra-South Asia is only 4% of our total trade. That's not at all a good, healthy thing. We have not been able to achieve what we should have achieved. That could be one of the reasons is the centrality of India. India is so central that everybody trades with India, but everybody doesn't trade among themselves. Like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Maldives, Bhutan, they are not doing. But because of the geopolitical presence of India, I think India trades well, and everybody is in a deficit. That could be the pattern, maybe influenced by geography or the dictates of geography. The China factor has been discreetly avoided. I think you have done the right thing, because if you China, it would create a turbulence that you cannot manage. And I think that's a good decision you have taken, and keeping the remit within Southeast Asia and South Asia. FDI in South Africa has increased more because of, I would imagine, a very Chinese, aggressive Chinese policy of extraction of minerals. Actually, that's very important because they need minerals. China is growing up, and this is one of the reasons why China's investment FDI is more extractive industry rather than. I fully agree with your observation on that. China is less dependent. Asia is less dependent, or South Asia is less dependent. No, entire Asia is less dependent on official aid. That is true because your statistics show less than 1%, and I think Africa is more than 3% the ODA, and that's the sign of maturity. It will overcome later on. Issue of external shock is getting embedded eventually because we are opening up, and as we open up, that your observation is perfectly right. And data integrity, we have a big problem in countries like ours, and particularly we have problem with data, which we are trying to solve with different support from the bank and so on. Busan, about Busan, I think Busan has given a lot of buttressing in this thought. In 2010, was it 2010 or 11? And where we have seen the coming up of a South-South cooperation, South triangular cooperation. We have some private sector investment. So these are the things which has given some new, fresh blood in this thing. So international finance. Okay, remittance, yes, remittance continues to be an important for us, for South Asia. And international, one thing is very important, which I think I should find out. I just want to, maybe I'd like to go for a little bit, let me see if we are, okay, on the international commitment for 0.7% of GNI, this is, it's right, but, and I think there has been a change. It's not 2020 is the year, 2020 you have to halve it. You have to halve the difference by 2020, and by 2025 you have to achieve it. Many of the countries, as you have said, including the United Kingdom, they have just got their 0.7% this year. I think Sweden, many of the Swedish, Nordic countries have done, because these are small economies, and achieving 0.7 is hard, but it's not as hard. But achieving for UK, it was challenging, and they had to cut the civil service and a lot of things they had to do. I would like to tell me about the time, if you have, because now the what, pardon? Another 2-3 minutes? Okay, that's fine. On the issue, what Jeffrey Sachs in his paper has suggested, and I tend to agree with you, and for the benefit of the House, I want to also say that there could be an idea like one donor or a group of donor can launch, like you can say the Global Fund for Education. One donor or a couple of donors can champion it, and that way you can do well. You can think about, rather than aid fragmentation, you do it one that gives some kind of, philanthropists can come in a big way. The Melinda Gates Foundation, they came strongly on health sector, and they gave way to Gavi, and Gavi is now the flagship of so I think this is a good way of bringing in, roping in philanthropists, rich people like Gates, and many rich people are in China, and people are from China are thinking of coming out together in support of that. UN has a contributing role too. Needs assessment, reporting mechanism to oversee the assistance of flows. The IATI, there is a IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, IATI. So you can get those numbers. There should be what is called publish what you pay. So those things, clarity, transparency should be, I think that should be helpful. Businesses can come. Business actually benefit from these things. So business can also come to help in this respect. Then universities, business schools can train the next generation of SDG leaders who will be there. So, what I would imagine there is other role that they can do is assess the indicative financing needs, which this FSD can do, financing sustainable development, is to assess the indicative needs, private, public, continue. Then we have standard of domestic resource mobilization. They suggest that there should be a standard domestic resource mobilization, which Dr. Devopriya was saying about this 20% for the developing countries and 18% for low LIC countries. Okay, so whether it is good or not, but there is an indication given to that. You have to strive, because we are still way behind. We are about, say, 13.5% of GDP with the revenue tax, revenue GDP ratio. International regulation to support domestic resource mobilization. That could be one way, where fair transfer pricing regime of multinational companies. They are doing, that could be a way by which you can rope in more resources in terms of tax. So central role of pooled financing is something that we can possibly think about it. Pooled financing is like we have in this country, like swap. sector-wide approach. In health, we have done, in education, and Professor Jeffrey in his paper also suggests that you can do this thing. Investment risk mitigation, increased emphasis and use of MIGA's support that the bank offers, and we have benefited. I myself benefited when I was at TRD. I signed on a power plant. That's helpful. So we have to ensure capital markets. How can you rope in capital markets and do the financing of SDGs? So broadly adopt principle of assessed contribution of climate finance based on pollutants must pay. This is because I think we should not separate SDG with climate finance. Climate finance must be integrated. It's time that you should integrate climate finance and SDG, because during the MDG, climate was not as acute, climate change was not as acute as it is today. So that should be a way we can consider that. Broadly, these are my observations. Thank you very much. I think it has been a splendid occasion to learn things from Dr. Deopriya's paper, and thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Arasto Khan, for sharing your insights and some of your observations with regard to Dr. Deopriya's excellent presentation. But you have also gone beyond that, and you have given us a number of potential resources, sources of resources, as it were, to tap into in terms of implementing the SDGs. Thank you very much for those comments. I would like to mention that we have been joined by our guest of honor, His Excellency Mr. Lee Wan-young, the Ambassador of Embassy of Republic of Korea in Bangladesh, and we have been mentioning that Korea has played a very important role in the context of financing for development. Particularly the Busan process was initiated there, and our program is also being supported by Korea. So thank you, Your Excellency, for joining us. I would now like to bring in our second distinguished discussant, Dr. Salman Zaidi, Poverty Global Practice Manager, the World Bank in Bangladesh, and we are hoping that he will share the broader view that the World Bank, a critically important player in terms of what we are discussing, what they have, the plans, and thank you, Dr. Zaidi, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much, Dr. Deopriya, for your excellent presentation. I want to pick up on the point that you've made, and then Mr. Arasto has also emphasized, which is the declining role of ODA, and the fact that you have seen countries rely much more now on domestic resource mobilization, on private investment, on remittances as a source of funding. They've tried to attract FDI. So other sources of financing are certainly much, much more important now than they were at the time when the multilateral institutions were set up. So I want to focus my comments on, what's the role that the World Bank and multilateral development banks, the MDBs, can play and particularly I'll speak about the World Bank. I think the World Bank can assist countries with the post-2015 agenda in three areas. One is data, the second is finance, and then the third is implementation. Let me pick up first on finance, where, as you mentioned, the region has a lot of heterogeneity. So for some countries, of course, the World Bank is not important as a source of financing, but for some we do remain important. MDBs, the multilateral development banks, are a way of sort of, as you know, financially leveraging scarce ODA resources and taking small amounts of paid up capital and turning this into a much larger source of financing for developing countries. That's a role that we will continue to do and think about how we can tap more innovative mechanisms for this. Another way that MDBs help is to crowd in finance from the private sector, tap private sources of financing, bring them in through our projects. I also wanted to bring to your attention that in the lead up to Addis, the World Bank Group is working very closely with other MDBs and with the IMF to prepare a joint approach paper for financing the post-2015 agenda. So that will be coming out soon. On the second point that I mentioned, second area where we could help, which is on the implementation, the SDGs actually mesh very well with the World Bank goals, twin goals, which you've heard have been recently announced, the emphasis on eradicating extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. The process by which the goals and targets for the SDGs have come about has been much more complex than what was the case for the MDGs earlier. One of the benefits of this is, unlike the MDGs, which were set much more on an expert opinion basis, here there's a much more involved and process from a much larger group of people. One benefit, of course, is that there's much more ownership around these, but also one of the drawbacks is that there is also much more complexity now than was perhaps the case. The bank group really clearly shares the vision behind the SDGs, ending poverty, saving the planet, ensuring no one gets left behind. But as I mentioned, one of the concerns we have is about the number of goals and the difficulty of sort of getting momentum behind them because of the very large number. We have initiated work on seeing how the SDGs can be translated into making our projects more effective and a focus of them. And I think as an institution, we are also well placed to assist countries because this is essentially quintessentially a multi-sectoral agenda, achieving the SDGs. On the third area, which is on data for development, I think the SDG process has really energized this. As Dr. Devapriya mentioned, there's a lot more emphasis and talk of this. We're working in this area, and data clearly plays a very important role because the quality and availability of information is a key factor in improving decision making. We are working in three areas. One is building on the 2013 data MOU between the World Bank, the UN, and the MDGs. And this has to do with the international commitment to build global data capacity and quality. We're also looking internally into more innovative approaches to data collection and how we can support them. Quite a bit going on in this area, and we have also established a data council, which is looking into changes in policy directives to ensure the data gaps that exist can be filled. We're also going to be directing more resources from the World Bank Group into strengthening data capacities within the country. And lastly, we're also focusing on filling the skills gap that would need to be filled within our own staff to provide the technical assistance and advice needed on the more expanded SDG agenda. So I want to go back. So these were the three areas. There's data, there's finance, there's implementation. But in this new world, one of the big ways that the SDGs are different from the MDGs is how much more the countries now are in the driving agenda, in terms of driving this agenda. So what will be critically important, of course, in the success of the SDGs will be the extent to which we have stronger institutions in countries, the degrees to which we have better policies, and lastly, leadership not just from the government, but also from civil society, from institutions and individuals of the kind that we see in this room. And that's going to, of course, be a critical factor. I just want to end by saying it's very nice to see that in this conference that you have planned, you have, in fact, a more, not the traditional topics, but I fully agree with you, these are, in fact, the most interesting and important topics to be talking about in the change landscape that we have. So the focus on PPPs as a source of financing, the important role of remittances, investing in data, these are all very important and topical subjects. So it's great to see that these will be addressed in this gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zaidi, for those excellent remarks, and it is also reassuring that you support the focus that we will be having in this event on the PPP, the remittances, and also the data which you have mentioned, particularly as Devapriya has said, a lot of buzz around data revolution, but there is also a lot of deficits in our countries, and it's also good to hear that there will be joint approach paper for World Bank, IMF, and other development partners in view of Addis Ababa. So this is also very reassuring. Thank you for those remarks. I would now like to bring our distinguished discussant, Dr. Sultan Hafiz Rahman, Executive Director, BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, BIGD. And of course, he is a former Director General of South Asia Department of the ADB. Dr. Sultan Hafiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for an excellent presentation. There are tremendous advantages to speaking last because a lot of what I needed to say has been said. But nevertheless, let me start by a provocative statement that when Jeffrey Sachs says that financing is the glue that holds the SDGs together, I actually disagree with that view. I understand the view, but I disagree because countries have historically progressed, not so much because they received large amounts of assistance, but because they planned well, they utilized their resources effectively, they were extremely good at executing their plans, and they were able to clearly understand what is in their own interest and what is not, and to be a productive member of the larger international community and play their part. So I feel that, we probably, in this quite different context than the one that we had at the turn of the century, a context in which for Asia the aid per se has become much less important. Here in Bangladesh, which was famously born as the international basket case, 40 years on, this is a country where aid accounts just below, for just below 2% of total assistance. So, and at birth it was more like between 7 and 8%. So this is a dramatic change, and in fact this has changed faster, and countries have graduated faster, not fully graduated, but almost graduated in the countries of Southeast Asia. And this changed context, I think other things will play, as my predecessors have pointed out, and as Dr. Bhattacharya also alluded to a number of times, that yes, aid will play a less important role, but I think the aid that actually is provided is very important. So I don't mean to suggest that aid has no role at all. All I am saying is that, this is another way of saying that the context has so changed, and that countries will actually now be far more assertive in this process. I think Salman was making the point that they are much more in the driving seat. So this is another way of saying something similar. So it will be much harder to make countries accept things that they do not find to be necessarily in their interest. Domestic resource mobilization will be crucial, no question about it. We have seen the revenue GDP ratios, the trade GDP ratios. They are still lagging, particularly in South Asia. The increasing and decreasing doesn't give you the full story, but the story really is not very promising at all. So there is a lot of room to raise domestic resources through reforms and innovative practices. Domestic private investment, which is a related issue, will play an important role. FDI will play, I think, the most crucial role in this process of transformation in the future. And there comes the question of the Asian behemoth, China. One can try to steer around it whichever way you like to, but I think these initiatives such as the Asian Investment Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Fund, and I'm sure there will be more mechanisms coming along the way. They're increasing bilateral partnerships with individual countries in Asia. All of this, I think, will have to be considered in the financing dialogue as the SDGs come into being later in the year. So I'm not sure that it can be entirely wished away. One has to find a way of how to engage with them in this process. The idea of 0.7% of GDP and trying to hold the OECD countries accountable for this, I think is like flogging a dead horse. It hasn't happened. It ain't gonna happen. So forget it. That is my personal view. I've been in this business for a long time, and my sense is it doesn't have to be, frankly. There are other mechanisms that are available. I personally think that trade can do a great deal for development and underpinning the achievement of the SDGs wherever we come out on the SDGs. So I think it can remain as some sort of an aspirational goal to keep reminding the more developed part of humanity that, that they have a certain commitment within this family of, in the 21st century, of having to share prosperity with the rest of the world if they want to. So I would use this much more as in that fashion rather than trying to put it down somewhere and then trying to hold them accountable for what you still haven't coughed up, your 0.7%. Frankly, they are not in a position to anymore. I don't think the kind of crisis that Europe and the United States are facing following the 2008-9 crash is not going to go away. I have always held this view. And it's not going to go away quickly. It was not something like a V-shaped kind of a recessionary phenomenon. This kind of debt overhang will take a long time to unwind. And a huge amount of restructuring of their industrial and services base needs to take place, and these mean painful political compromises within their countries, which are very difficult processes. And frankly, I don't see this resolving itself in any time in the near future. I would give this another 10 years. You would look at the 1997 financial crisis in Asia, which was a minuscule of what happened in 2008 and 9. Have those countries got back to the growth path that they had before 1997? Most of them actually haven't. So despite being very strongly growing countries, this has not happened. So it is difficult. These kinds of debt problems are difficult to resolve. My sense is that this kind of recovery will trudge along. You will be in and out of recession for quite some time. It may take the better part of the next decade. So they are really not in a position to make very, to commit huge amounts of resources towards the SDGs, especially because these negotiations are taking place now in 2015. If they were taking place in 2030, it might have been a different situation, but by then the countries who are recipients will also have dramatically changed. Anyhow, I feel that I was talking about trade, I was talking about the inability, of the industrialized world to support to provide the kind of financing support that they have in the past. But I also feel that in the country should be able to borrow much more over the next 5 years, and where the OECD countries might want to focus is to try and reduce these risks of borrowing by the developing world. So it would be a different and a more innovative way of trying to finance development in the present context. And by development, I mean the achievement, of course, of the SDGs. Okay. I suppose, and I think in the end I would say that it is never a good idea to create parallel institutions when it comes to the actual delivering of the finances. I feel that, there has been an education foundation or trust. There may be an global SDG trust, but these should be managed by international development agencies that exist and have experience in managing these processes. And these should be an open trust fund, if there is one, to supplement the borrowings that would take place. So let me, I think, end there. I hope I've made use of my 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sultan Hafiz, bringing some realism to our more enthusiastic, some of the aspirations that we have. But I think that your insights are very important, and although you have rightly mentioned that although the 0.7% may not be achievable, but as an aspiration it has to be there. And I personally think that you mentioned about trade, but in order to have the trade-related capacities in our countries, we will also need aid. But your some of your obviously suggestions and insights are very important. Thank you for sharing those. We now have about half an hour of open discussion before I bring in our guests here. We have with us distinguished guests who are with us, and also our expert group participants. And we have also representatives from various organizations like the UNFPA, Save the Children, FES, and other guests here. So I will request so that we can give more time, more of our participants an opportunity. I will request you to be very succinct and brief. So, okay, please, yes, I will, yeah. Please introduce yourself and then we can take it from there.
I am Professor Milindo Chakraborty from RIS New Delhi. I have a few observations and comments, and my comments, I must confess, has been encouraged by the keenness of Dr. Bhattacharya to write more papers in the future. To summarize the whole presentation, what I could find, that this excellent paper identifies the strategic areas where Asia and South Asia and Africa can cooperate among themselves in generating the necessary political will among themselves, and also identified some of the areas where really the twines do not meet and they are poles apart in terms of the issues to be achieved. In terms of the suggestion that I would like to offer to Dr. Bhattacharya in terms of writing more papers is that I found the identification of the 2 years, 2000 and 2013, a little bit arbitrary. Given the availability of data across the Asian and African countries, perhaps an exercise in using a time series data and finding out the trends of these variables across the years, and also finding out the sort of structural breaks, if any, in the trend across the Asian and African countries will perhaps give us much more clarity in identifying the issues at hand. There was another concern that Dr. Bhattacharya rightly expressed, that the inclusion of China and India will change the trend altogether. I would also like to suggest if some exercise can be done as to how sensitive the inclusion of India and China would be in the understanding of the trends of these variables over these years. Maybe that will open up our eyes, and that will also help create the necessary political will, as you suggested, not from an altruistic perspective but from a pragmatic perspective, as to how the countries should join hands together in coming to a conclusion, strategic conclusion for financing the SDGs in this conference and beyond that. So these are my suggestions for improvement of this.
Thank you for those suggestions. I'd now like to bring in Ms. Argentina Matevel, a country representative, UNFPA.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to start by echoing the speaker before, thanking the UN Millennium Campaign and the CDC for a very stimulating discussion, and including me as a representative of UNFPA in Bangladesh in this discussion. My comments will be twofold. The first one, of course, as a representative of UN Population Fund. The second one, I will beg to be speaking on behalf of myself as a citizen of the Global South. So the first one is that, of course, this whole discussion of financing for development cannot be complete unless we make it. I want to bring it back to the centrality of the people, the population dynamics, in really looking into how this whole discussion of financing, is it the financing that will determine ultimately the success of the SDGs when we look into them, whatever number of years we have agreed on, maybe 20 or other. I want to agree more with Dr. Sultan Rahman when he says that it's not so much just the funding itself, but rather the utilization. And when we look into the MDGs, the main failures are on mainly in two MDGs, MDG 3, gender equality and women's empowerment, and MDG 5, maternal health. And the centrality of those two bring us back to the whole issue also in terms of the whole population dynamic into investments made to adolescent and youth, which is our most active group that, and the promise for the future, the investments in the human capital, in their brain power, to be able to galvanize development from within the country. And then the women and girls. Regardless of which country we look at, there may be some disparities in just differences of 2 to 8 or 10 years, but normally there's equal parity when we look into the statistics of what constitutes women, female, and what constitutes male in the population censuses. So it is very important that member states, governments in their discussions really look critically into themselves, into how they have utilized and allocated their resources to the different, looking into these two critical population groups. Having said that, we looked into the graphs which the very distinguished economist, Dr. Debapriya, has presented to us, and talking even into issues of taxation. Those are very important. It's not the ODA that will bring countries really to where they need to be. And as we saw, it is reducing. It is the whole issue of the ability of governments to utilize the incomes generated from either foreign investments or from the actual internal investments. But how can people participate to be able to pay their taxes if their productivity is so low, which stems from the whole issue of the investments in their brain power? Those two sectors that we all talk about, education and health, could not and should not be underestimated, because those are the engines for development. Going to the second point, as a citizen of the Global South, I want to bring us to think in a very challenging way. I agree, again, it's not surprising, because BRAC, being very much involved into the social aspects of development and as a UN worker and development specialist, I tend to think that it's not so much what others are bringing into our countries, but I want to bring the concept of the social contract between governments and their citizens. To what extent are the G77 really looking into themselves, into their own accountabilities? And I want to beg to disagree with the distinguished Dr. Debapriya in saying that the success of the Addis meeting would be the presence of the G8. No. For my own opinion is that it is the G77 themselves looking critically into themselves, into their accountabilities, reclaiming the power and the responsibility for their development, rather than continually giving those G8. They have failed us. 65 years of development aid. They have failed. Why are we still looking at them? They're looking into their interests. The G77 have their responsibility now to look into their own accountabilities, their governance issues, into how to increase, and I'm pleased that the SDGs are talking about the means of implementation and monitoring framework, because it is up to the country itself to agree on what they need, and linking the process of governance and electoral system to how they have fared in the last term or the last time of their governance. In other words, having a process of monitoring where they in the initial times of their contract with the citizens present what they agree to do in a consultative manner. Let's say for Bangladesh 7-year plan, this is what we are planning to do, and we promise you that this is what we will drive at for 5 years. At the end of during the 5 years, a monitoring framework with a feedback system with citizens, and then an evaluation where citizens again are brought together in a partnership strong with government, because they have entrusted the government to lead them in the development process, not to hijack it, but to lead, and then seeing have they fared well or not, and link that into the electoral system where the citizen will say, oh wow, they have done well in this, we will vote them in again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Mathaval, for those insightful comments and bringing some new dimensions also in our discourse. I would now like to invite His Excellency Mr. Johan Friesel, the Ambassador of Sweden in Bangladesh. What do you say?
Thank you very much. It's a very good opportunity to listen to the Global South. I'm very impressed by the speed, intensity and integrity of the process that happens here. Southern Voice, the expert meeting. I think it's a key factor for success of the Addis conference, and then ultimately for the adoption of the SDGs, the involvement of civil society and experts. When I hear these critical voices on countries that do not achieve the 0.7 target, as a representative of Sweden, I don't feel affected. So it gives me an easy time to take the floor. And I agree that there is a reason for pessimism on the, let's say, realism in getting all the industrialized countries to reach the target. And we have to remember that the first discussions appeared even in the 1960s. General Assembly Resolution in 1970 established the 0.7, and then it was reduced from, there was a discussion of a 1% target initially, and then 0.75, and then it ended up in 0.7. And then by mid-70s, all the industrial countries should have achieved that. And in 1975, we were 3 countries, I think, who had come to 0.7. But in the policies of my government, we actually stuck to the initial 1% idea, and that's where we are now. Preliminary figures from OECD this for 2014 puts Sweden at the top position at 1.1%. So we have a not entirely clear consciousness. As the UNFPA representative is not only representing our organization but also the Global South, I can speak as a representative of the Global North. And as a citizen, and I can say that, of course, generally we have failed. How come that a number of rich countries, big or small, stands at 0.3 or 0.5? It's a failure of political parties, politicians. It's a lack of visions in the Global North to stick to this. And I don't agree that it is more difficult for a large country to reach 0.7 target. It's a matter of policy, financial planning. Everything is relative. But I think you're right, Mr. Sultan Ahmad, that don't put too much hopes in this. We will try as a northern country to continue to put peer pressure on our neighbors to actually go for this, because in absolute numbers, the ODA will still be needed. It will still be needed. We have examples here in the chart for the South Asian and Southeast Asian countries where the dependency on ODA is decreasing, which is very good. But there will be a number of countries still out there. And if we look at the MDG scoreboards, practically every fragile state, every post-conflict state fails to reach a single MDG. I think that's where we have to put our efforts in the long term. These are countries which cannot rely on the growth of a national tax system, because they don't have the capacity nationally to build this. These are countries which are repeatedly drawn back into violent conflict, and all these success factors that we see in the presentation by Devopriya on remittances and national taxes and inter-regional trade. I mean, these countries, the fragile states, post-conflict states, these patterns are they are disrupted from time to time. So I think there is a lot of good ideas. I think a lot of countries in this part of the world is emerging gradually in a positive way, but there are still a lot of countries where we have to focus ODA, and the funding from the OECD countries is still required. Thanks.
Thank you, Excellency, for those very insightful comments. And as citizen of Global South, I would agree with you, a citizen of Global North. And thank you for your words of appreciation with regard to the speed, intensity, and integrity of our process. Thank you. I would now like to bring in Mr. M. Saiduzzaman, Member CPT Board of Trustees and our former Finance Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by congratulating, as usual, Devopriya for a very exhaustive presentation along with his co-author. He has covered almost everything, but I would like to mention a few things which could be added to your paper, Devopriya. First of all, I would like to refer to a statement made by Mr. Faluniye about the vast natural resources of Africa. You mentioned this is definitely connected with financing of the SDG, but the problem there is the trade, export and import routes. They are mostly landlocked countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Their exports are expensive, their imports are expensive, and not all countries are similar. The Botswana produces diamond, it can be flown by aircrafts. But near at home, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, we have no problem because of SAARC and bilateral agreements, but Afghanistan has a problem. So, especially for sub-Saharan African countries, these landlocked countries, there should be some special mention. I don't know, I have not been fortunate to look at the May version of these objectives, goals and objectives, whether it is there. You would like to consider about that. Second thing is that nobody has so far talked about PPP. So it is supposed to be one of the important sources of financing mentioned in your paper. I don't want to add to that, looking at the experience that we had, though some other countries had better experience about that. Secondly, about remittances, it's okay, but its impact on financing SDGs, in my view, will vary from country to country. I saw the BBS figures. The 70% of the remittance received in Bangladesh is used for consumption. So if that is the case, I don't know how much you can invest for financing the SDGs. I may be wrong. Please correct if I am wrong. And thirdly, nobody has mentioned about the China's Infrastructure Investment Bank. You may not bring in China in the comparison of Southeast Asia and South Asia, but there is no objection to, in fact, I think that will be a good source for financing the SDG objectives. I am not very hopeful about the BRICS. Brazil is in bad condition, Russia is in bad condition, even South Africa is not in a particularly good conditions. But I certainly would like to mention the Chinese Infrastructure Investment Bank as a possible source of financing MDGs. The other thing which I did not hear or I did not see in the previous paper is the evolving subject of migration and policy formulation for that. This is a very important thing which is happening not only in Europe but also in Southeast Asia on large scales. This needs some attention. Finally, I like to come to what Mr. Arustu Khan said about Jeffrey Sachs' idea of having a trust fund for education. In that, I would like to agree with Sultan Hafiz Rahman. You will be surprised to know that the World Bank probably has now a very, very large number of trust funds. I don't know how it came to be. I don't know about their origins, But as Mr. Salman Zaidi said, they have a system of implementing trust funds. Sultan Hafiz also said that, so it should be given to international development organizations. About the point made by the Honorable Representative of UNFPA, I fully agree with her that we should not depend on this 0.75%, and Sultan Hafiz also said that. I remember that in the middle 70s we had this new international economic orders after the 0.7 percentage of GNI was agreed as the aid target. And I also remember how the new international economic order was killed in the May 1981 Cancun conference. So it's not really wise to depend on this 0.7% GNI for financing of the MDGs. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your comments and insights. Thank you, sir. Dr. Simrit, you wanted to? No? But, yeah.
My compliments. It was a wonderful presentation, extremely comprehensive. But just maybe if you could share your thoughts on the fact that the Asian region is very high on the savings rate, but it's the mobilization of the savings which causes a problem. And in this context, to the extent we are trying to bring in financial inclusion, how would it affect the financing for the SDGs? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very good point. Mr. Asif Ibrahim is one of our leading entrepreneurs in Bangladesh and chairman of BUILD.
Thank you very much, Chair. I look around the room and I can only see one private sector representative here, and that's Asif Ibrahim. So obviously private sector may or may not have a very important role to play in the you know, we have the open working group who've set up the goals. You know, we have the 17 goals and 169 targets, and we will be adopting it in the United Nations Summit on 25th and 27th September 2015. The SDGs are going to be a reality. We are talking about discussing the modalities of financing the SDGs. I congratulate Dr. Debapriya for a wonderful presentation. Now, the role of private sector is extremely important in achieving these goals. However, in order for these to happen, there's going to be significant investment requirement across the region, particularly in the developing economies, in infrastructure, in healthcare, in climate change adaptation for particularly vulnerable countries like Bangladesh, and of course food and energy security for highly populated countries in the region. We talked about public finances. Yes, the public finances needs to be scaled up to increase the rate of public investment. However, the public investment is not going to be enough, as it was clearly seen in the presentation of Dr. Debapriya. But in order for the private sector to come up and invest in SDGs, we strongly feel that there needs to be a change of business mindset to encourage them to invest in sustainable development goal related investments. A very important topic that you know, we perhaps forget is that the future growth, not only from the private sector but also public sector and also from ODA initiatives, has to be based on low carbon emission based growth. And a recent study said that it required almost $2.5 trillion in developing world to realize the SDGs, and as I have mentioned, the public financing cannot mobilize it alone. So definitely there is a need for ODA to come in some manner, and also those would encourage the private sector to come forward too. There has been some new concepts that has been discussed. Sustainable investment is a new concept, and to get sustainable investments, there is a talk of setting up sustainable exchanges. Now these are also the areas that one can look into for financing the SDG initiatives. There is also the sovereign wealth funds in the world which manage assets of more than $6 trillion, and the public sector pension funds worldwide are almost triple the figures. So maybe we can look into the SWFs to also play a significant role in SDGs. Now, from Bangladesh private sector perspective, investment in SDGs or green businesses going forward in future, one of the biggest constraints that we have always talked about in all the forums is access to finance. And for, like Salman, for, World Bank and international agencies, it is very imperative to come forward with funds. There has been some initiatives. We know that IFC and GIZ or I think they had mobilized $500 million worth of funds, which was channeled through some of the private banks, and which was made available to Bangladeshi entrepreneurs at a labor plus very marginal amount of interest rate. Those kind of funds are very much required. We need billions and billions of those funds, not only in Bangladesh, but also in developing economies, because you cannot make investments, borrowing at 13-14% rate of interest. So the intent is there. Okay, but we need access to funds, to green funds at a very affordable rate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Asif. Appreciate that. We have with us Mr. Muhammad Alkama Siddiqui. He's the Additional Secretary, ERD, External Resources Division.
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to reciprocate to Mr. Asif Ibrahim's skepticism that whether private sector is going to have any focus on the sustainable development. Actually, there is a very strong thrust upon private sector now in the sustainable development goals and its means of implementation. And I would like to inform you that I have been following the sustainable goals, particularly financing for development process. I have attended the last second drafting session, and there was a continued outline of difference between the developed world and the developing countries. The developing countries' focus was mainly on substantive issues, poverty eradication, and all the unmet goals of the MDGs. And the developed world is mainly their concern centered upon procedural issues like the enabling environment to promote sustainable development goals. The striking difference between the MDGs and SDGs are going to be, as Dr. Bhattacharya mentioned it, the MDGs are a top-down approach, but SDGs is going to be a bottom-up approach. Before for framing of these SDGs, there have been so many consultants at different levels, also in Bangladesh, to how to shape the post-2015 development agenda. At country level, there were several consultation sessions in different locations and at different levels. So this is going to be a very highly owned, universally owned sustainable development agenda. And the MDG lacked in a strong focus on partnership, but SDGs is going to have a specific voice on partnership, particularly the goal 17, which is replacing the goal MDG 8. MDG 8 was void of any target, even indicators. To my assumption, the sustainable development goal, as it is being conceived of to be a universal and unified in the sense that in eradicating poverty, we have to take care of environment. Our poverty eradication should be sustainable in terms of environment. This is going to be unified, and there is an apprehension that whether we have to face a challenge of a trade-off between poverty eradication and environmental sustainability. We have to take care of this approach, because what progress has been made in poverty eradication need to continue, but we cannot make a trade-off between poverty eradication. We cannot keep our focus away from poverty eradication for the environmental sustainability. That has been a very strong point of negotiation at the FFD drafting session. And as has been the case in Dr. Bhattacharya's presentation, countries, developing countries are getting more or less international public finance support. International public finance flow has been declining particularly since the global financial crisis that happened in developed economies, not the causes from our developing economies. But the brunt of the failure of the developed economies are felt substantially in our developing countries. We have to take all these measures, all these issues, while we are going to a new financing arrangement. In Addis Ababa, what we are expecting that first, the commitments made need to be implemented. Many of the monetary and Doha Development Action Plan have not been implemented, and we have raised our voice that the commitment of overseas official development assistance need to be carried forward. Unmet ODA commitment should be carried forward and to be estimated how far it has been behind to achieve at least the MDGs. In achieving MDGs, there are gaps between our achievement and our targets. And the contributing factor may have been, in some cases, our capacity, lack of capacity, but still the substantive contribution may have come from the lack of resources that we need. So, from our experience of MDGs, we have to frame out our financing for development as envisaged in the SDGs. The unique characteristics of SDG have been that every goal has its own means of implementation. And while we are going for financing for development agenda, so we have to have a synergy between the means of implementation of the SDGs and financing for development. For civil society, this will be a very fertile area of cultivation of your thinkings to help the people like us who are development practitioners. We need your insight in this area where we can go forward much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Siddiqui. And the whole purpose of this EGM is, in fact, to provide inputs to the to people like you who will be doing the negotiations. Thank you for your insights. Yes, Miss Jennifer. Miss Jennifer, yeah. Then I will bring you, and then at one stage, Miss Hagar-Rus, would you like to come at one point? Okay, then we'll round up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you to CPD and all the co-organizers for inviting us here in Dhaka. I just have 2 points. The first one is on ODA, which, well, many others have already commented on this, but I would just like to highlight some important points to make here. And then on the other one is on domestic resource mobilization. So on ODA, I think I would disagree with some of the viewpoints that the 0.7 target is not relevant anymore. I would say that it remains an important target for which to assess the level of commitment to development cooperation that the world has achieved. In terms of determining the importance of ODA at the moment, it has been mentioned that ODA remains important for least developed countries and fragile states because they still have huge financing gaps. But also even in middle-income countries, there are certainly many sectors and areas where other sources of financing will not venture into, and ODA aid definitely has much contribution to make in this, especially in reducing poverty and inequality. So in Addis, I would say that recommitting to the 0.7% target is just a bare minimum. As pointed out earlier, this is a target that has been set 40 or so years ago, and therefore I feel that it's really it still has value in following up on this commitment. On domestic resource mobilization, I agree with the position stated by others that this is a very crucial resource for financing for development. But there is also discussion or debate or much focus to consider in terms of the capacity of developing countries to be able to harness domestic resources. Capacity in terms of institutions as well as legislation. This is because at the moment there is really high rates of tax evasion, and nobody has mentioned yet the issue of illicit financial flows, which obviously needs not just the efforts of the countries, of developing countries, but the concerted efforts of many countries, of a multilateral concerted effort. So those are just my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would now like to bring Mr. H.K. Young. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. In my previous life as the PPP advisor with the Commerce Secretariat, when I run workshop, now we used to tell the public policy makers that the private sector does not bite, they only bark. But on the flip side, I think the private sector, the sole representative here is not here now, so maybe it's the other way around, that they fear the public policy makers. I think the word landlocked was mentioned by the former finance minister, and talk about trade in the presentation as well. It's very interesting to note that in the OECD report in 2013, it says that reducing the supply chain or infrastructure barriers is 6 times more impactful on GDP growth than just reducing trade barriers. So it's something quite interesting to note. And Prof. Simrit, you also mentioned that there's a lot of savings in the economy, household saving. And I think you're going to present a very exciting paper after lunch. This is not just advertising for you. The paper is going to be very exciting. Just as a note, ADBI published a report last month in which it noted that for South Asia and Southeast Asia, the annual requirement, funding requirement for infrastructure is $385 billion a year. And the household savings for the same region is $1.3 trillion. It's amazing, really. There's a lot of liquidity in the market. In other words, household savings, the money that you put under the pillowcases or something, can fund annual infrastructure 3 times. So when we talk about funding from the various international organizations, perhaps we should look at the domestic liquidity. There is a lot of money there. When it comes to PPP, I'm very passionate about it. But I always warn people that it's a double-edged sword. It can be. It's not a magic bullet. So you've got to structure it extremely well, because otherwise you're going to be haunted by the PPP project for the next 20, 25 years of your life. But PPP is actually, if you see it, it's a very, one of the most wonderful taxation scheme, because if you get the users to pay, they can't escape. So there's no taxation leakages. You make sure that the user of the facilities will pay for the taxation. Now coming to the last point, the AIIB, it's a very interesting development. Up to date, as of last month, 57 countries have agreed to join. That's tremendous. And the interesting thing to note is that of the 57 countries, 20 of them are not from Asia. And some of the countries say that we have to join in the interest of our national businesses. So they are beginning to see that AIB is going to be a conduit for a lot of infrastructure projects. Another thing to note about AIB is that they are thinking of using PPP to leverage the $100 billion capital which they're going to put in. So in other words, if you put in $1, you get a private sector guys, he's gone now, to put in $10, which they're more than willing to put in $10 if the projects are feasible. So in other words, you just leverage 10 times, so you could end up with $1,000 billion. Also very interesting to note, 2 days ago, the Islamic Development Bank has said that they are in discussion with AIIB to try to use Sukuk, the Islamic bonds market, which in turn will give them greater leverage. And also very interesting to note that Islamic Development Bank, of which they evolved from the OIC, and the OIC has got 57 members as well. So if you are a real believer of conspiracy theory, there must be something, conspiracy with the 57 number. So with that, I just thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will now bring Ms. Nandi Collins from UNDP, and then should be followed by Ms. Hagar Rus of Save the Children, and I think we can then round up the full floor discussion.
Thank you, Chair. Let me just add my voice to my Indian colleague from RIS to make more suggestions to this excellent paper you've done. And then by looking more of the emerging issues in this region, India, China, and looking at these new institutions. People already mentioned a lot about AIIB, about Silk Fund. You know, for these people maybe only when we're talking about AIIB and Silk Fund, but we also need to look at the larger issue of this whole China's One Belt, One Road strategy. This whole financing mechanism are established to support the greater vision of this regional connectivity, regional integration, and markets. And then by doing so, we should explore, like you rightly pointed out in the paper, to see the increasing trend in intra-regional trade that is increasing in all parts of the world, to see how we utilize this new financial mechanism, these new economic corridors that it's under development, to increase this regional trade, intra-regional trade, and to how, and further to explore how this financial mechanism can support the SDG. Because right now the discussion is more about infrastructure trade, but that the linkage between those issues and SDG is still a bit weak. And then that's a kind of contribution we could make in also putting these two political track on the financing flows to under this common framework of sustainable development goals and with a human development angle.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rose?
Thank you, Chair.
The children's voice.
I'll conform to type, and I will say that I am speaking with the voice of children, although I don't know if I'm the most appropriate person here in the room to speak on it. But just to say, thank you very much, Dr. Devapriya, for the great paper, and very interesting to hear all these learned comments. I mean, for us at Save the Children, the conference outcome and events are about prioritizing children clearly and to tackle inequality so no child is left behind by progress. In terms of what we would like to see in terms of political and financial commitments is to end preventable child deaths by 2030. We want to make sure that that is a focus of the negotiations for the next accord and also of the conference itself. Disparities in health, education and living standards will continue to grow unless the financing community, whether it's a private or the public, allocates sufficient and creative mechanisms to resource the SDGs and to ensure that the SDGs continue to capitalize on the success of the MDGs to allocate finances to reach poor and marginalized children. So I think that's what I think that's the best that I can add to this particular discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that particular perspective, very important. Dear friends, I think we can round up the floor discussion. Is there anyone who would like to share his or her views? Henrik, our friend from the FES German Foundation, no? Okay. Dear friends, thank you very much for sharing your insights. I think Dr. Devapriya and his co-author, Mr. Afsar, will take care of those, and I think that they have got a lot of insights and new ideas to strengthen their paper. But more than that, I think our expert group meeting was convened in order to really brainstorm and think about new ideas, and from that perspective our three distinguished participants and all of you have contributed a lot. I would now, before I bring our guests, I would give Dr. Devapriya a couple of minutes to share his views with regard to the comments that have been received, and also as I mentioned, we have so many friends from the Bangladesh print and electronic media. Our friends from the media will be taking our messages to our broader audience in Bangladesh. So this program is also live streamed. So there are also many people who have been seeing this program from outside by hooking into our CPD website. So to facilitate their formality with the discussion that we have, I would like to request Dr. Devapriya also to speak a summary of what we have discussed in Bengali. I think that will be good for the broader audience that we have outside this room.
Thank you. And is that summary included in your 2 minutes or outside? take away the distortions, so the finance really follows where it should be there in that way. And there is where the policy matters, institution matters. And that's why we say that I have mentioned in presently that countries with different, similar type of tax GDP ratio, countries with similar type of aid dependence having different levels of ODA flow, FDI flow. It is all because of the institutions and the policies. So policies and finance has to go hand in hand. It's not an either-or situation. That would be my first observation on this debate on whether we can do without finance. The aid issue, I think the Ambassador of Sweden has already responded to that, and also my colleague from IBON has responded to that. The critical point is at two levels. One is, of course, the fragile state, the conflict-ridden countries. Look at our colleagues in Nepal at this very moment, what is happening. Our colleague from Nepal could not really make it because their office building got cracked and the families are in distress. There is another colleague who also couldn't get it because, not because of earthquake, but because of the political quake, because he couldn't get his visa issued. It's a country from in the subcontinent called Pakistan. So that those issues are there. But the issue is here, how do you deal on aid issues? Also on the issue which has been mentioned, that for the low-income countries, low-income countries and middle-income countries, how do you do the leveraging? In fact, having said that ODA has no such role, Sultan Hafiz Rahman, my senior peer whom I look upon on many issues, we have to work together at BIDS, he's mentioned at one point in time what we need to do is to create guarantees and insurance and underwrite the risk. Which type of money is going to underwrite that risk? It is the ODA which can also underwrite those risks and all those. So by saying that, he himself has possibly given us the cue. So the future of finance, if I mean one blending is institutions, policies and finance blending. Here within finance, the name of the game is blended finance. PPP and many other places, it is blended finance. This is how the catalytic role of the ODA in leveraging in certain way to reduce the risk and providing the guarantees for private investment. I think that is the other debate which went around. I think we can converge on that particular point, that the ODA still has a role, and the role is to do those market leveraging and etc. etc. There was another debate which went around a bit on the issue of which Mr. Arastu Khan mentioned about creating vertical finance. He referred to Gavi. I think this Gavi vertical fund is a bit different from the World Bank trust funds and proliferations of the other trust funds. So this is a vertical fund concept. You do that. Vertical funds has its own pluses and minuses. We also know that. Earmarking in that sense is also has its own pluses and minuses. Currently there are two vertical funds which are at this moment competing for the SDGs. One is the education, but a much more different fund is really ahead. That's infrastructure. The infrastructure trust fund is at this moment possibly more ahead than the education fund as it stands, and it has its own pluses and minuses. I can't go into that at this moment, but it is also not very helpful in slicing up everything into vertical funds, and the donor coordination, fragmentation, all those issues are very much over there. So these were the three major, I think, debates which we had over here, and I think this can be all brought into the fold as we go, and the other issues are very much there. I also appreciate the inputs from bringing how citizen-centric or people-centric financing mechanism, which has been mentioned by colleagues from UNFPA and also Save the Children. And also Mr. Saiduzaman mentioned about the migration issue over there. That's also a human dimension over there. So the whole approach of finance at the end of the day is not an end in itself. It at the end is a means of implementation. And as we answer the issue to be brought in, the most powerful message of SDGs, if you ask me, is about the leave no one behind. If you have leave no one behind related to data, that means more transparency, accountability, and as the process goes. The last political point which came around about G77 versus G7. It's not just a number of 11 times. It's much more than that. It's not. It's a more qualitative issue. I think the problem with the G77, let us also recognize, since we are amongst friends, that we know the problems of G7 very well taken. We will all. Let us discuss G77. G77 has become a group of heterogeneity of highest order, and there is a serious conflict of interest also amongst the group. As a member of the least developed country group, and I have led that group in Geneva, I am fully aware of how it goes, is that it is quite difficult sometimes to deal with other bigger countries and also the other marginalized countries as they move. So there is also a political tension within that. Recognizing the solidarity, possibly it is also time to recognize the heterogeneity. Without the recognition of that heterogeneity, it will be very difficult to move forward as we move all that. And if you find it's very heartening that at this very moment the countries like South Africa is leading G77 or Brazil coming on board. But there were times there was no taker of G77 groups in New York. Country like Fiji and many others, I'm not undermining those sovereign countries, with relatively lower capacity would come and lead their countries, not necessarily the big ones at a certain level of. So I think G77, in order to reclaim the leadership, will have to also have some introspection. That would be a self-criticism I would like to do as a supporter of G77. Let me come to the point on that, Bangla ekটু দূর বলি যে আজকে যে আলোচনাটা হলো মূলত হলো তো এশীয় মহাদেশের যে বিবর্তনশীল অর্থায়নের চালচিত্র সেই আলোচনাটা হলো এবং সেটার ভিতরে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে এই প্রেক্ষিতটা খুব দ্রুত পরিবর্তিত হয়ে যাচ্ছে। এখন দেখা যাচ্ছে যে এই সবগুলো দেশ এশিয়ার, আমাদের দক্ষিণ এশিয়ার অথবা দক্ষিণ পূর্ব এশিয়ার বৈদেশিক সাহায্য নির্ভরতা খুব দ্রুত কমে যাচ্ছে। কোনো দেশই এখন সেই অর্থে তাদের উন্নয়ন প্রকল্প বাস্তবায়নের জন্য বৈদেশিক সাহায্যের উপর নির্ভরশীল থাকছে না। যদিও বৈদেশিক সাহায্যের একটি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ভূমিকা থাকছে, যে সমস্ত দেশ এখনো বিভিন্ন ধরনের সংঘাতময় পরিস্থিতির ভিতরে রয়েছে। যে জিনিসটি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ হয়ে আসছে সেটা হলো যে সবগুলি দেশই তার উন্নয়ন প্রকল্প বাস্তবায়নের জন্য অভ্যন্তরীণ উৎসের উপরে বেশি নির্ভরশীল হচ্ছে। বিশেষ করে ব্যক্তি খাতে বিনিয়োগ গুরুত্বপূর্ণ হয়ে দাঁড়াচ্ছে। ব্যক্তি খাতে বিনিয়োগের ভিতরে বৈদেশিক বিনিয়োগের ক্ষেত্রে আরো বেশি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ হচ্ছে। কিন্তু এই জায়গাটাতে এখনো এশিয়ার দেশগুলো আমাদের উপমহাদেশের ভিতরে বাংলাদেশ সহ এখনো দুর্বল অবস্থানের ভিতরে রয়েছে। যেটা গুরুত্ব সহকারে আরো বেশি ইতিবাচকভাবে আসছে সেটা হলো রেমিটেন্সের থেকে আয়, প্রবাসীদের থেকে অনাবাসীদের থেকে আয় এবং একই সাথে বৈদেশিক বাণিজ্য থেকে আয়। এবং বৈদেশিক বাণিজ্যের ভিতরে আন্তঃআঞ্চলিক বাণিজ্য আরো গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ভূমিকা নিয়ে আগামী দিনে আসবে। সেহেতু আমাদের আগামী দিনের চিন্তার ভিতরে অর্থায়নের ক্ষেত্র হিসেবে অভ্যন্তরীণ উৎস থেকে সাহায্য সংগ্রহ, অভ্যন্তরীণ উৎস থেকে রাজস্ব সংগ্রহ গুরুত্বপূর্ণ হচ্ছে, বৈদেশিক বাণিজ্য গুরুত্বপূর্ণ হচ্ছে, রেমিটেন্স আয় গুরুত্বপূর্ণ হচ্ছে। এবং এইগুলোকে ঠিক মতো টেকসই করার জন্য বৈশ্বিক এবং আঞ্চলিক যে নীতি কাঠামো আছে, যে প্রাতিষ্ঠানিক কাঠামো আছে, সেগুলিকে শক্তিশালী করা দরকার। না হলে আমরা যেহেতু আরো অধিকতরভাবে বৈশ্বিক অর্থনীতির সাথে যুক্ত হচ্ছি, বৈশ্বিক অর্থনীতির যে কোনো ধরনের ঝুঁকি খুব দ্রুত আমাদের অর্থনীতিকে কাবু করে দিতে পারে। সেই জায়গাটার উপরে আরো বেশি নজর দেওয়ার উপরে গুরুত্ব আরোপ করা হচ্ছে। এবং এই কাজটা করার ক্ষেত্রে আন্তর্জাতিক পরিমণ্ডলে যেই আলোচনা সহযোগিতা পরিবেশ দরকার, সেইখানে উন্নয়নশীল দেশের ভূমিকা, তাদের বক্তব্য আরো জোরদারভাবে কিভাবে নিয়ে যাওয়া যায়, সেই চ্যালেঞ্জটা তো মোকাবেলা করাটা আগামী দিনে খুবই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ হবে। Many thanks for you for listening to us. Thank you very much for being here. Grateful.
Thank you, Dr. Devapriya, for your comments on the comments that we had, and also for sharing the key messages that our participants have shared to the broader audience through the Bengali statement that you have made. Thank you very much. We would now go into the finishing lap of our quite lengthy session, and I would now request our guest of honor, His Excellency Mr. Lee Young, the Ambassador of Republic of Korea. As we have earlier mentioned, Korea has been a major player in the context of the SDGs, and the Busan process, which started in Korea, was also very a key development and milestone in that process, and the Republic of Korea and the embassy have been a great supporter of that process and the event that we are having today as well. Your Excellency, please.
Thank you for inviting me to this important Asian Experts Group meeting. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good morning to you all. First of all, I'd like to say deep apology for the being late. And then, Honorable Minister, I'm not expert in the development, so I would like, if you allow me, I share my the Korean experience and policies, and with some of my personal elements based on my prepared paper. Honorable Minister Mustafa Kamal, and then UN Representative Robert Watkins, and then Executive Director Mr. Fizur Rahman, and Dr. Tepaprio, and then Excellency, distinguished guests, and the participants. It's a great pleasure for a privilege for me to attend this expert group meeting on Asian Partnership in Financing SDGs. I'd like to thank the CPD for inviting me to this important meeting and the communicator speakers and then experts gathered here. Ahead of the Addis Ababa conference in coming July is very timely organized. I hope that a successful recommendation based on the common consensus will be prepared through the fruitful exchange of views and discussions, which will play an important role in this preparatory process. Ladies and gentlemen, as you may agree that the landscape of development of finance has been evolving fast, as we have witnessed more actors and more diversified types and larger volumes of aid resources in recent years. Recognizing this diversification, Korea welcomes the drafted elements for the third UN Conference on Financing for Development and emphasizes that this conference should squarely address the current landscape of development finance, reflecting the changes in respective roles on various development actors. Among today's agenda, public-private partnership and the roles of overseas remittances are a very important issue and considered to be a crucial impetus of the sustainable development for many Asian countries. However, I'd like to start with the role of ODA and the importance of mobilizing domestic financial resources from the perspective of Korean experience, both of which also clarified among the 6 development resources and the means in the Monterey Consensus. Firstly, Korean perceives that the ODA should remain essential development resources, as already discussed today, especially for those most in need and vulnerable. The Zero Draft also well reflects the catalytic role of ODA in mobilizing additional resources. Therefore, the need for maximized impact for the sustainable development by better allocating ODA and seeking the appropriate mix of various development resources should be considered in a serious manner. Knowing the importance of ODA by our own experience from the past, Korea has been putting the great effort in expanding its ODA. While in 1991, our total ODA marked only 58 million US dollars, the amount of last year reached more than 1.9 billion US dollars. This represents an increase of 32-fold and proves how Korea has been considering the ODA as an important factor of development. Of course, it's less than 0.7%, but we tried. Yeah. Yet the ODA alone cannot be means to respond to the transformative development needs we are faced with. Firstly, I'd like to remind you that the governance plays an important role in leading the mobilization of sufficient development resources to the actual implementation of development goals. Already clarified by Dr. Tepaprio. Secondly, the domestic resources are critical as the most direct source of financing for development. Private resources will gain more and more importance to address the new dimension of the sustainable development framework, which widely embraces economic, social, and environmental issues. The international community should be formed on the complementarity of these resources to ODA. The challenge for us is to build a new financing framework which identifies all resources available, mobilize the potential assets from the different sources, whether national or international, or private or public, for addressing the overall scope of sustainable development goals, which we are to adopt in September. To better explain this aspect, let me share with you the experience of Korea. As you all may be aware, Korea is the only country that transformed aid recipient the country to the donor country by achieving the unprecedented growth within the past half century. Between the 1953, the right after the Korean War, and 1961, the Korea received about 2.3 billion US dollars of foreign aid. Foreign aid accounted for 9.3% of GDP in 1960. Although the aid helped Korea in terms of survival and the poverty reduction, but it failed to connect to its sustainable economic development without the government appropriate policy to effectively utilize the money. While the economic growth rates during that period stagnated with a range of 3.7% on average. In early 1960s, the new Korean government realized the necessity to facilitate the mechanism to mobilize domestic finance. I'd like to introduce two good examples. The government initiated institutional reforms, which established the National Tax Service and introduced a value-added tax system. By these reforms, it gained nearly 70% more tax revenue without a new tax in 1967 compared with the previous years. So we are exactly the same page with Dr. De Paprio. So tax system reforms is very much important in mobilizing the domestic resources, I think, from our experience. Efforts for domestic financialization did not stop there. As a second strategy, the government initiated a campaign for raising the domestic savings. One example was that the children entered the elementary school, then piggy bank was distributed for savings, and then all students was asked to open the bank accounts to deposit the piggy bank, their own piggy bank money. All of these started as a small movement, but these efforts brought major changes. The savings rate in Korea reached around 35% in 60s. So by mobilizing financial resources domestically, the level of aid dependence has been dramatically reduced. The point I'd like to emphasize here is that although the foreign aid played some role in Korea's post-war recovery, but it was mobilization of domestic finance that brought the social and economic development in Korea. The per capita GDP increased from $65 in 1962 and then to now the $30,000, 462 times increase. As I just mentioned, the Korean government's role in the aspect of the domestic resources mobilization was crucial. However, that doesn't mean the private sectors are any less important. With increasing importance of private sector, more active and action-oriented cooperation between the government and the private sector should be further promoted. Bangladesh also places great importance on the PPP program as part of the government Vision 2021. Let me share with you about the PPP case of Korea. Korean government played a leading role in paving the ways for the private sector to independently grow after. This was done the first through the government investment in infrastructure. The first highway built in 1969 and the first subway introduced in 1974. Second, the government took the lead in industrialization. One of the world's biggest steel maker, POSCO, electricity and energy are good examples. The third, the government actively promote export by providing incentives such as policy financing, low customs duties for raw materials for export, and then corporate tax cut. However, all the other industries was left for private sectors to minimize the government intervention. There was a consensus among the players in Korea of the division of labor. To some, the public-private partnership has played an essential part for developing countries to promote growth, because the transition to a more sustainable development model requires not only political will and good governance, but also the joint cooperation among the governments, business, and society. This will eventually call for the behavioral changes and corporate responsibility and the sound policy instruments. Another factor requires good utilization for the economic development is remittances, one of our today's agenda. According to the report by the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics in 1913, almost 8.6 million Bangladeshi workers are currently working abroad, which takes up nearly 5% of the total population. The country is among the top 10 remittance earning countries in the world. Thus, as we are all aware, the remittance play a critical role in the Bangladeshi development process. There has been some reports, however, a large amount of remittance has not been utilized in an efficient manner to produce the expected economic returns for overall development of Bangladesh. According to the ILO, the 2/3 of remittances received have been used for consumption, and at best, only 1/3 has been invested for development, policy and programs, and awareness building campaigns and training for migrating workers and families is highly needed in order to raise the greater investment source and build a mechanism for will effectively utilize the development resources. I'd like to conclude by reiterating the Korean position in respect of financing for development. First, Korea hopes the different development actors will reach the common consensus of ways to achieve the reasonable, practical means of development. Second, Korea recommends that developing countries to place policy priorities on taxation, remittance, and the trade of surplus and FDI in order to build capacity for self-reproduction of development resources. Last but not least, Korea will make sure the value of money of the limited resources and maximize the effectiveness through the inclusive partnership. Furthermore, Korea reaffirms its commitment to continue efforts to expand its ODA and fully committed to sharing the constructive suggestions based on the past development experience during the course of preparatory process. We should always bear in mind that the only sustainable and inclusive economic growth will be the ultimate solution to the long-term financing for development needs. In this regard, in the run-up to the adoption of the transformative development goals, we must stand in solidarity to come up with the diverse means of implementation in Addis Ababa. Thank you, Dhanyavad.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you for sharing the Korean experience. I think it is relevant for all of the countries from Asia that we are here, and also reiterating the commitment of the Korean government to the SDGs. Thank you very much for your kind presence this morning. Dear guests, it's now my pleasure to invite Mr. Robert Watkins, UN Resident Coordinator and UNDP Resident Representative in Bangladesh. As we have mentioned earlier, UN is a key player and a driver of the process in the context of the SDGs, and we will be looking forward to hearing from you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and also Executive Director of CPD. I'd also like to recognize His Excellency, the Minister of Planning, Mr. Mustafa Kamal, for being here. Of course, Ambassador Lee from the Republic of Korea, my colleague Sereng Falo Ndiaye from the UN Millennium Campaign in New York, and of course the gadfly of this whole exercise, Dr. Devapriya Bhattacharya. I've been practicing those 9 syllables for the last few hours, and I hope I came close, but I like Deb even better. First of all, again, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you today about the UN perspective on this. I think it's very timely for a couple of reasons. We've already talked about the upcoming conference in Addis Ababa. But also, and I think we should be proud here in Bangladesh, over the next 2 days we're going to be having an important conference organized by the government with some help from UNDP, talking about financing for development. And we have a very distinguished group of visitors who will be talking over the next couple of days that I think will give some insight into this very important subject. I think in order to do justice to this subject of Asian partnership and financing for development of the SDGs, it's important to look a little bit at how we've performed on the MDGs. I'd like to talk a little bit also about, in general, South-South cooperation and what are the opportunities here in Asia. And then finally make a few concluding remarks about what the UN could bring to the table in terms of assisting in this process. While it has been mentioned that we are the kind of guarantors of the process, I think we have a very important role to play. So first, let's talk a little bit about the MDGs. As you know, they were introduced, when they were introduced, they were quite innovative. quite an innovative new approach in tackling development. It posed a simple question. How do we alleviate global poverty by 2015, or at least reduce it by 50%? What the MDGs did was they defined a set of development challenges that were at that time considered to be the most pressing. They also put together a framework that gave us benchmarks, they gave us quantified progress indicators, and bound them into this time frame. And the framework did one crucial thing. It brought the world together to recognize collectively and endorse collectively what those targeted resources for ODA working towards specific sectors would be. And of course, recognizing that a healthy and a well-educated population has many positive development outcomes, and at the end of the day is really the foundation of sustainability. However, now looking back, and that's of course what we are doing and have been doing over the last year as we prepare for the next phase of the development agenda after the MDGs, we've seen, of course, a number of weaknesses in the MDGs. First, we found that the MDG framework was inflexible to country contexts. Not all goals and targets were necessarily relevant, but also the means of implementation were not very well defined. Some people say, in fact, that's one of the strengths of the MDGs, but when we look to the future, I think we want to find very tailor-made recommendations, country by country, according to their needs, and having them defined specifically by the countries. That's one of the strengths of the MDGs. But the MDGs are also known for focusing on the social sector and investing in human development. While human welfare is a core component of sustainable and meaningful development, by design, the MDG framework's targets and indicators did not measure the quality of development. Finally, on the MDGs, we saw that there were potential goals that were completely absent in the original framework, such as governance, such as job growth, as well as increasingly important development issues that have emerged in the last decade, such as climate change. If I turn now to look at South-South cooperation, this year, as you all know, is the China-backed Asian Infrastructure and Investment Development Bank, which has recently been launched. Bangladesh was a founding member. This not only marks the changing nature of development cooperation and partnership, but increasingly recognizes that development is not predicated on only a north-south dynamic. We've spent a lot of time today talking about the 0.7 indicator and how important that was perhaps 15 years ago, but is increasingly becoming less and less relevant. While we still, of course, encourage countries in the north to recognize that target, I think increasingly we're seeing the rise of South-South cooperation and how important that is in revealing two very important issues. The first is that with alternate sources of financing, developing countries could set their own development agenda alongside the attainment of the MDGs. The second is that it was more powerful for developing countries to ally and learn from each other, particularly if this cooperation had mutually beneficial outcomes. And referring to this example of the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor, or BCIM initiative, we see that it really is an innovative economic concept that was first introduced in the early 90s by Professor Rahman Sobhan. The building of this corridor will no doubt benefit Bangladesh's intra-regional trade. For Bangladesh, of course, this is an important development, as currently there is a reliance very much right now on European export markets in limited trade sectors. It's not just trade that the BCIM initiative will facilitate, but all of the other benefits that come along, all the multiplier benefits that come with this kind of connectivity. That include the exchange in knowledge, culture, and technology, mobility of people, generating employment and using local brains and manpower to build the facilities and the corridor itself, growth of secondary and tertiary industries to service the corridor, and regional cooperation that will also benefit regional stability. When looking to specifically Asian financing of development and the SDGs, we're not just looking at financing between countries, but also mobilizing domestic resources within countries. Structural economic transformation relies on incubating and developing potential growth engines of the country with a supporting legal and regulatory environment, both to facilitate development as well as to protect the public interest. This transformation, amongst other measures, is based on an economy that has healthy savings, diverse foreign direct investment and trade, and the development of small and medium enterprises. These will look towards generating revenue to support public expenditure, which also means taxation. We've talked about public sector development and how that has to be harnessed, and we also heard a little bit about taxation and the problems of getting people within the countries, particularly in Bangladesh, to pay more attention to taxation. There was a recent report in the Dhaka Tribune which said that without including low-income earners, 7 million people in Bangladesh are eligible to pay taxes. And of those, only 1.1 million actually filed their tax returns. This is less than 1% of the population. Essentially then, Bangladesh needs to take the road that leads to economic self-reliance. I believe, therefore, that there are two lessons in this. One, we need to get more people into the productive and into decent employment. And two, this requires a broader awareness on taxation per se, as well as the responsibility of government, business, and individuals to contribute towards national development. And this brings me to my final point. What does financing for development actually mean for the SDGs? We all know that Bangladesh has experienced tremendous economic growth of roughly 6% over the last 10 years. SCAP, as you may have heard yesterday, predicted Bangladesh's growth to continue this year and next year at 6.3%, between 6.3 and 6.5%. So there's no doubt that Bangladesh's growth trajectory has been positive and probably, at least for the near future, will remain positive. However, if we look closely at where that growth is coming from, we see that it is largely determined by remittances, by the RMG sector, and by agriculture. These constitute the largest share of the country's GDP. Remittances, which rely on the labor demands of other countries, RMG, which relies on low-skilled, low-wage, and low-productivity employment, and agriculture, which employs nearly 45% of the labor force. These have contributed greatly to Bangladesh being able to reduce extreme poverty, and in the case of agriculture, has seen Bangladesh become rice self-sufficient. But we also know that this is not sustainable in the long term. It's not going to define Bangladesh's country's growth for the future. And I suspect and I fear that very soon we may be hitting a ceiling. It's not sustainable, not just because of structural changes to the economy that will deliver more pathways for economic growth, but also because reliance on this economic model widens income disparities and in turn also widens social, gender, rural, urban, and regional disparities. Bangladesh, dear friends and colleagues, is in danger of development progress that benefits the rich while the poor are left behind. What this tells us is that economic growth and human development are equally two sides of the same coin. Financing both sides requires complementary development and economic frameworks that speak to each other. Economic growth without equity has emerged as one of the core components of the past, and we hope that with the SDGs and broader development in general, that these problems will be addressed. Emerging Asian partnerships and South-South cooperation will definitely continue to increase in importance in the next development framework. But that does not mean that traditional donors and organizations like the UN have no role to play. What I see is that we have to reshape and we have to redefine according to the country's development agenda and adapt to the changing dynamics of development cooperation. Come September, when the SDGs are finalized in New York at the General Assembly, we must remember that economic growth should drive development and be used and measured to achieve the next set of goals, rather than necessarily be seen as an end in itself. While the modalities of how development take place can change, in many ways, we essentially return to the heart of the MDGs, where I started from, which is to say that the eradication of global poverty has to remain the overriding objective. Hopefully, this time round, we've learned from the mistakes of the past, and we're learning with the SDGs how we can do it even better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robert Watkins, for sharing your perspectives on the lessons to be drawn from the Bangladesh experience, and also the cautionary notes that you have shared with us. I think if we have to take the transformative journey in future, we will have to be careful with regard to those points that you have made. Thank you very much. And also I'm very happy that on behalf of the CPD that you have mentioned about the BCM economic corridor and its potentialities. This idea was first mooted by our chairman, as you said, Professor Rahman Sobhan, and CPD has been very active in terms of advancing the BCM economic corridor idea in the subcontinent and with China. Thank you very much. Dear guests, excellencies, it's now my pleasure to invite our chief guest, the Honorable Minister for Planning, Government of Bangladesh, Mr. H.M. Mustafa Kamal, Member of Parliament. He has been very kind always towards CPD, and whenever we have requested, he has always given a positive response to our request. I know that he has been very busy. He has just this morning he was coming from his constituency, but he made it to our event, and I think that time as always, and I think that we are on behalf of the three co-organizers, we'd like to register our deep appreciation to the Honorable Minister. And this is also an important time for him. He is designing the 7th five-year plan of Bangladesh, and the implementation of that 7th five-year plan of Bangladesh will coincide with the first few years of the SDGs. So I think from that perspective also, I am hoping that he would have also benefited from the discussion that we have here. Over to you, Mr. Minister.
Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I would like to say that who are coming from outside, all of you are my guests and guests of 160 million people of Bangladesh. Before I speak, I would like to express my deep condolence to the people of Nepal and India who have lost their lives very recently because of the earthquake there, and you are aware of that. It is really wonderful for me to be here, and I'm thankful to CPD for giving me this opportunity to hear all of you who have spoken about a subject which is the central point, or which should be the main point for any government. Because you see, poverty and hunger, these are always disgraceful for any person, for any nation, and to the humanity at large. So really, I don't know where from I should start my discussion. But if we go back about 200 years back, at 1804, the world population was 1 billion. Of the 1 billion people, at that time, 850 million people were living below poverty line. Today, we are 7.24 billion people. Exactly, if we don't the same number, but we are almost near to that. At that time, 85% people, 20 years back, 85% people were living below poverty line. Now, the situation is changed. Although it is still over 800 million people living below poverty line, but percentage is now is around 12%. At that time it was 85%, now it has come down to 12%. So this transformation has taken place over a period of 200 years. If we try to analyze how this could happen over a period of 200 years, these dramatic changes in the landscape of humanity, we see one thing. You see, when America was built, it was built by Europeans, it was built by Africans, it was built by everybody. Even if we look at Singapore, what we see, Singapore was built by Chinese, by Indians, and by others. And the same thing, if we look at Malaysia, what do we see? Malaysia was principally built by Chinese, local Brahmaputras, and then the Indians. You see, during the last 200 years, for a major period of time, there are no restrictions of movement of people from one place to another place, movement of goods from one place to another place. You see, every country is endowed by the God Almighty. Every country has its own potentials. Some gifted endowments. With the Bangladeshis, we are also endowed with some gifts, some gifted endowments, and that is our manpower. But what we find here now, over the last, say, six to 7 decades, there are so many restrictions on the free movement of goods from one place to another place. In case of Bangladesh, so many restrictions are being imposed even by America. There are tariffs have been imposed, there is quota restrictions, and about the manpower movement, you see even today, you have seen in the newspaper, people are stuck in the middle of the sea. Even they are not allowed to get down from the ship or from the vessels. So, you see, we are now here for a greater cause. Cause is to service to humanity. So, it is our religious commitment, religious responsibility. It is our social responsibility for all of us. Now, if we look at the different countries in its proper perspective, we see the countries, if they are allowed little freedom for exporting their goods, for sending their manpower outside, in that case, they are being benefited largely over the last few decades. Now you see, from one country to another country, there are 280 million people are working outside their home countries. Bangladeshis are only 9 million of the 280 million. And the remittances, inflow of remittances, total amount is 480 billion in 2014. It amounted to, in 2014 it amounted to $480 billion. Out of that, our share was 14.2. This year it will be over $15 billion. So the safety net is very big. If we are allowed to send our people freely from our place to other places where they are needed, in that case, we could maximize our own resource. We could maximize our own. We could have been in a better shape to
turn the destiny of our own people. So now you are here. You are here to make some suggestions for the Addis Ababa summit. I really I appreciate that that the comments you are making here, it will really go, it will really go there, and then it will be considered reasonably by the people who are involved in the total exercise. In Bangladesh, you see, in Bangladesh, we are trying our best, and we have been, as some of the discussions said, once upon a time, we were a basket case. So from that position, only 2 years back, the Secretary General of United Nations, he has appreciated Bangladesh. He has appreciated Bangladesh, and he said Bangladesh is the role model. And he rather suggested that other countries should follow Bangladesh. Although today, we see some apprehension from the same institution about the sustainability of our achievements, what we have achieved over the last decade, during the last decade. I can assure you about that. You see, Bangladesh also, we have a plan, and we are pursuing some policies, and we are also objectively we are moving forward the targets what you are fixing now to achieve those targets. You will be very happy to note in Bangladesh, even during 80s, less than 30% boys and girls are going to schools. Now it is 97% boys and girls are going to schools. We have achieved many successes, as you are aware from the United Nations report. Now, our target is, right at the moment you see in Bangladesh, less than 24% people are living below poverty level. And extreme poverty level is less than 9. Our target is, by the year 2021, to bring down the poverty level to less than 18, and then the extreme poverty level to bring it down to the level of 7%. And it is our commitment. By the year 2030, this country will be absolutely hunger-free. You will not find anybody is having this disgrace in their life. So, how it is possible? It is possible because we are, if you look at the macroeconomic factors or macroeconomic fundamentals of Bangladesh, you will be seeing in the last 6-7 years, we have been growing and growing very fast. Our revenue to GDP has increased from 7 to 10% almost now. And total revenue intake has also gone up very significantly. During the last 6 years, we have never grown less than 19%. So our average growth rate is 19.5% during the last 6 years' time. Even this year, having so much turmoil in the country, our first 9 months revenue generation is having a growth rate of 19%. So it says how we are planning and how we are moving forward. You see, as a planning minister, I'm not saying anything here, but as a human being, like one of you, because all of you are not involved with politics, but as a human being, you are involved with the humanity. As I have said earlier, it is all of our religious responsibility and social responsibility to obviate this problem, so that the people who are not having education, they should have proper education. The people who are not having health care, enough health care, we should be more cautious and careful about them so that the service could be provided to all of them. In Bangladesh, things are moving in that direction. 15 years back, our life expectancy was 47 years. Now it is 70.3 years. So the changes are there. Infant mortality has been reduced, maternal mortality has been reduced very significantly. Vaccination is there almost everywhere. So for everybody, vaccination is there. So we have built definitely a foundation and making more strong foundations. We are investing for the future. We are investing for education, for infrastructure, for healthcare, and for social safety networks. So we are not leaving anybody behind. And there is, you will find hardly any differences in our approach for taking care of the people who are living in the cities or who are living in the villages. We are looking forward for an inclusive growth, as you have been suggested, as you have suggested. You see, now we will have to have some reforms. We have to bring in some reforms in our taxation system. While entering into the room, our chairman for this event, Dr. Mustafa, he has told me that our revenue intake has to be increased, that there are loopholes, so those things should be plugged in properly. I'm sorry because I have some sickness, because that is the reason even I take my water bottle in the parliament, because I've spent so much amount of money, and most of the money what I spent, it has gone to Singapore. But the Singaporean doctors suggested me that this is your lifeline. Always you have to carry this on. So you don't feel embarrassed, because in parliament also I've been, as a very special case, I've been allowed to carry my water bottles. Now, sir, you see, we know our missing links. In order to prosper a country, we know what are the resources. We know what are the strengths. A country, in order to move forward, it has to have certain advantages, certain distinctive advantages. One is geography, other one is demographic advantages, and the other one is resources, and also vitality in the economy. We are having all these things, so we don't see any problem even to have a sustained economic growth in our country. We are not moving very fast. We are moving slowly and gradually, and our approach is to sustain the growth. We have seen China was growing 14%. Now they have come down to less than 7%. We have seen India was growing 9%, over 9%. Now they have come down to less than 6%. I'm not saying anything against them, but sometimes if you try to hurry up in your development process, I think all of you are economists, development economists, and in that case you will agree with me. So there is a limit to everything. During the 17th century, when King Louis was the king of France, he had his finance minister. His name was John Colbert. So he was telling how to collect revenues from the people. I mean, how to tax the people. So he was saying one thing. plug the feathers from the goose as maximum as possible, but be careful. The goose should not be hurt. So our policy is also like that. We are trying to, definitely we are trying to collect revenues from the people, and we are having 19% growth. None can say that over the years we have increased the tax rate. We have broadened the base little bit. You are very right. You are very correct. Our 3 million people should pay taxes as per the growth of the country, what we have achieved. But out of that, only 1 million or 1 million plus, they are paying income taxes. Now, from this year, we will be definitely seeing a change in our methodology for collecting taxes. We want everybody in Bangladesh should be brought to TaxNet. We will not increase the tax rates, but the people who are capable of paying taxes, everybody should be brought to the TaxNet, and that is the objective we are aiming at, and then hopefully we will be successful. And if it is like that, in that case, we will be having enough resources at our disposal for helping in achieving the SDG goals. SDG goals, all of us are in agreement that they are realistic, and the goals are good for everybody and should be achieved. You see, you have rightly mentioned, in order to achieve those goals, what are the basic things you need? The basic things, you need strong institutions, you need good governance, you need a commitment from the political people as well as from everybody, not only the political people, from everybody in the society who are responsible for bringing in the transformation or for bringing in the changes. In our country, it is not only the government, it is the private sector who are the prime mover of our economy. Even for bringing this particular topic or the SDGs to be successful, we need money, we need investment. Investment from local sources, investment from outside. ODA is very important. ODA has been playing a very vital role. Definitely we need more ODAs during the coming future. And in our country, if you look at the investment scenario, in that case you will find over 76% of our investment is coming from the private sector. So government role is less than 24%. Here, government is always trying to encourage the private sector. They should take the lead, and they should take the lead and transform the economy. Government is here to play a supportive role. So exactly we are following the same thing, same model will be following in the future as well. So what I'm saying, that your message should go to Addis Ababa, and they should take a note of it, that the country's gifted endowments should be properly exploited. In our case, I am saying only about Bangladesh. We should be allowed to have more inflow of remittances. And there is a huge potential for us. My friend, His Excellency, is from Korea. So, you see, they are taking a large number of Bangladeshis. To my information, over 100,000 Bangladeshis are now they are in Korea. So they are sending back home their hard-earned money in there, and it is helping us. So if we could send our people, because you have a demographic dividend, here we claim it like that, because the people having an age group of between 19 to 65 or 64, things like that. So we are having almost 40% people, and we will be having this demographic dividend until 2035. So during this time, during this period, we should be allowed to send our people as maximum as possible outside, and we should be allowed to export our products from here to other countries without any restrictions. So this is my appeal to all of you, and if it happens like that, in that case, Bangladesh will be possibly the first country in the Southeast Asia to achieve SDG goals before the time frame we have fixed for. So with these few words, I'm again saying all of you are my guests of 160 million people in Bangladesh, and feel yourself free and give us good suggestions so that we can carry it forward. And at the end of the day, our objective is common, to serve humanity. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. On behalf of all of you, the co-organizers, the Center for Policy Dialogue, the Southern Voice on Post-MDGs, and the UN Millennium Campaign. Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for sharing your very important thoughts and your support for the process that we have initiated today. And also thank you for your perspectives with regard to how Bangladesh will be going forward. We share your aspirations, but there are many challenges, as I have said, and together our nation, of course, will try to achieve those. Thank you very much for your support. Dear guests, we have been running over time, so I will not try to do any concluding remarks. I would like to thank the Minister, the special guest, the guest of honor, and our three very distinguished discussants. We had a very, I think, insightful comments and reviews and assessment of the paper, excellent paper that was presented by Dr. Devapriya this morning. I think that our two-day event has started off in very strong footing, and we are looking forward to the three thematic discussions on the public-private partnership, remittances this afternoon, and tomorrow on the financing for data, the data for SDGs. We will now go for lunch, and it will have to be a very quick lunch. We assemble here in about half an hour, because our guest of honor for the next session, the Secretary for Finance, Mr. Mahbub Ahmed. We are in the budget making session now, but he has been very kind to be present as our guest of honor in the next session. So he is also here. So thank you, Mr. Mahbub Ahmed. And on behalf of all of you, I would like to once again register our deep appreciation to all our guests who have joined our experts, and I would like to join all our designated luminaries over us with here, and thank you very much. And now we'll go for lunch. Thank you.